This is Taking Aim with
Joan Mellen
and Maya Schoen, coming to you Tuesday, October 11th, 2005. We have a remarkable program for you today, a unique opportunity. We have in the studio with us author Joan Mellen. Her book, soon to be released, is A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History. It will be published by Potomac Books and with the release date in November. Now, Jim Garrison's prosecution of Clay Shaw and his investigation of the JFK assassination was the case that should have changed history. And in fact, Joan Mellen's compelling book and her investigation over 7 years will change history. Hi, Joan. Are you there?
Hi, Maya.
Hello, Joan.
Hi, Ralph.
Let's start by saying a little bit about who Joan is. Joan Mellen, Temple University professor and author, is well known for her biographies of Lillian Hellman and Dashiell Hammett, Kay Boyle, her film criticism and filmography of Marilyn Monroe and the Battle of Algiers and many Japanese filmmakers and movies, and also a biography of Bob Knight, one that is outside the realm of the usual sports biography. Joan is the author of 17 books and countless articles that have appeared in the Baltimore Sun, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Philadelphia Inquirer. She's been a professor at Temple University, particularly one of the creators of the Creative Writing Program, and in 2004 was awarded the most coveted Great Teacher Award for her outstanding achievement, particularly in the Graduate Writing Program. Ralph?
Well, Joan has, as well, Maya, written a very important investigative book called Privilege, which is an investigation of the death of Sasha Bruce, who was the daughter of David K.E. Bruce, who was the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain and one of the key figures in the OSS, the predecessor of the Central Intelligence Agency. But with respect to A Farewell to Justice, let me say to you that A Farewell to Justice, in my judgment, is far and away the most significant document and investigative work ever to emerge with respect to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I speak from some experience here, because I have to say to you, brothers and sisters, that as many of you are aware, my work with Bertrand Russell entailed the formation of the Who Killed Kennedy Committee in early 1964. We brought Mark Lane to London. Rush to Judgment was written in my flat in London. We indeed were engaged in this effort, and I can tell you from experience, and that includes an acquaintance and involvement with Jim Garrison, that nowhere has there appeared a book as devastating in its documentation, an exhaustive survey of witnesses, and its involvement with the very plug-ugly contract killers, the people who were not just involved in discussing the assassination, but in implementing it, the coordinates. These are the people who Joan ferreted out and has nailed. I am convinced that for decades this is going to be a benchmark book, and its evidence and its documentation and its witnesses perused, studied, and the implications are no longer implications. It's right there. The head of the intelligence services, the Central Intelligence Agency, and military intelligence are the authors of the execution of the President of the United States.
Over the next 3 hours, we'll be discussing with Joan the most remarkable investigation yet. Joan, what was the motivation and why did you begin the reinvestigation of the Jim Garrison inquiry into the John F. Kennedy assassination?
Maya, I began writing a biography of Jim Garrison. I was a biographer, and I thought he was an interesting person whom I had known. And I thought I would talk about his handling of the office of the district attorney in Orleans Parish. By the time I was into it for, some months, I realized that this was going to be a book about his investigation, a biography of his investigation. And after that, I realized, too, that his investigation went only so far, and it was only after the passage of the JFK Act in 1992 that voluminous documents were issued by the FBI and CIA and became available in the National Archives, and that these documents had much to say about the investigation begun by Jim Garrison in the 1960s. So my book really begins as a biography of Jim Garrison, then becomes a biography of his investigation, and finally is an investigation of my own. And I found witnesses whom Garrison knew about, but who never really were forthcoming in their discussions with Garrison, and finally revealed what they knew only at the very end when I saw them. In fact, I did the last interview for this book in June of 2005 in Miami because I wasn't satisfied with the explanations for why Bobby Kennedy opposed Jim Garrison's investigation so strongly.
We're going to be going more into the particulars of Bobby Kennedy and his interference with the Garrison investigation in the second hour. But right now, let's look a bit more at what the structure of the Garrison investigation was and how you actually peeled away all the layers and then were able to substantiate what he had found and then went even deeper so that you actually got to the core of the relationships that showed that Oswald was not a lone assassin, that in fact Oswald, Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and many others were involved in the conspiracy to assassinate John F. Kennedy.
Joan?
Yes, sir.
Yes, well, we were, that was a question, I think, but in any event, the question here, I think, has to do with what allowed you to reprise Jim's investigation and to take it to the places where he could not go.
How did I do it? In other words, how did I do it?
How did you do it? And, of course, you know, a huge array of data and evidence wasn't available to Jim during his lifetime. But then the actual ferreting out of witnesses and the interviewing of those witnesses and inducing them to come forward and to acknowledge the relationships, the planning of the assassination and its implementation, that is your work. Building on Jim Garrison, though it may be, I have to say that, and I speak here as someone who is experienced in this, I have never seen anything like this. Please expatiate a bit.
Okay, Ralph. Well, as you were talking, I was thinking of one particular witness who enabled me to see Lee Harvey Oswald's role and that he was involved with people who were involved with U.S. Customs, for example. And I was driving down the roads of Louisiana searching for anyone who had been involved with Garrison's investigation, who knew Clay Shaw. And I was driving in Bogalusa where I met one of Clay Shaw's friends. And this friend said what he had to say, and then he said, you really should talk to my wife. And his wife came out and said, I had gone to junior high school with Lee Harvey Oswald. And so when he knocked on my door one day and said, does Juan live here? I knew exactly who he was. They'd gone to the same junior high, and she remembered him well. She called him Harvey. And it turned out that her neighbor was a man named Juan Valdez, who later would be the chief suspect in the murder of a doctor named Mary Sherman, who was, we think, was involved with one of Garrison's chief suspects, David Ferry. And so I learned about Oswald's relationship with Juan completely inadvertently. In another example, I got the information about how Oswald, Clay Shaw, and David Ferry traveled together to Clinton and Jackson in a very mysterious way, but with this very association of Oswald with Shaw pointed to the fact that the cover-up of the assassination had begun even before the shooting in Dallas. Well, I traveled across that ferry from St. Francisville over the Mississippi River, terrified because it seemed to me as if that raft were about to sink and you had your car on it. And I drove to Eunice, Louisiana, and I met one of Garrison's investigators named Ann Dishler. And Mrs. Dishler didn't want, when I finally got there, she didn't want to show me her notes because she felt that she had been betrayed by a previous author who wrote a book denying what was actually in the notes, which she had seen the notes. And 2 years later, I found myself driving through a monsoon over the Atchafalaya swamp back to Mrs. Dishler's house, where she sat with me for days, not only showing me the notebooks, but also discussing each page and all her memories of because the book was somewhat in shorthand, very quickly written. And so I learned about that very important trip that Oswald took with Ferry and Shaw up to Clinton and Jackson, where Oswald applied for a job at East, which is the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson, and where I later learned, and this Jim Garrison never knew, actually through a doctor named Dr. Frank Silva, that Oswald did indeed apply for a job at that hospital, And this was an incident Jim Garrison knew about, but which some people have denied ever happened. But I certainly knew it did happen because Dr. Frank Silver was the medical director of the hospital during the summer of 1963. And he saw Oswald in a very different mode from the Oswald who stood on Canal Street and handed out leaflets supporting fair play for Cuba and was supposedly pro-Castro. Because what Oswald did when he was at the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson was talk about how he was going to kill Castro. And there I learned that Oswald was indeed there, and that Oswald somehow believed that his function was going to be to kill Fidel Castro, not to kill John F. Kennedy.
Well, in this regard, I think we need to explain to our listeners just the significance of the placing of Shaw and Lee Harvey Oswald and I believe Guy Bannister together in the same place, conspiring, as it were, to position Oswald in certain key respects. But perhaps we should elucidate, Joan, the Central Intelligence Agency relationship of Clay Shaw and indeed of Oswald and of David Ferry, the key figures that we're discussing here.
Okay, well, let's talk about Clay Shaw first. Clay Shaw was the man whom Garrison indicted for participation in the conspiracy to murder John F. Kennedy. And when we look at Clay Shaw's background, what we find is that he rose very rapidly in the Army, although he never actually appeared on the field of battle. And it was clear that he worked with military intelligence during the war, during the Second World War. When he returned to New Orleans, he was from Kentwood, Louisiana, although he wrote on his CIA file, his application or whatever, the CIA file says that he was born in New Orleans, and that's what Shaw said when he was arrested. In fact, he was born in a town called Kentwood, and he came back to New Orleans and immediately joined something called Mississippi Shipping. Well, Mississippi Shipping was a CIA proprietary in New Orleans. And from there, Shaw joined the International Trade Mart, where ultimately he became its managing director. And the International Trade Mart in New Orleans was a CIA project, as were several other such trade marts that were enacted by the CIA. It was particularly important in New Orleans, which was a port and heavily infiltrated by the CIA. Shaw then really was very grateful to the CIA for promoting him. He actually was a high school dropout, never had studied economics, didn't know anything about trade, yet was the managing director of this huge international trade mart. And so I think Garrison thought, when the CIA called Shaw and asked him to look after Oswald in the state of Louisiana, Shaw could not help but agree to do it. It's not that Shaw had anything really, that he had a desire to murder John F. Kennedy, but rather that he was fulfilling an assignment in repayment for what the CIA had done for him. You could see some traces of Shaw's relationship with the CIA when one of Garrison's investigators, actually an assistant district attorney named Richard Burns, one day telephoned Clay Shaw at home, and he said, "Is John Shaw there?" And Shaw was suspicious, and he said, "Who sent you?" Which is not the sort of thing you would say to someone calling up whom you don't know who sent you, but Shaw was obviously accustomed to receiving such telephone calls. The key piece of evidence that Garrison developed about Shaw really had to do with a meeting that took place at the home of David Ferry. So I'll say a couple of words about Ferry. Ferry was a disgraced Eastern Airlines pilot, and he was disgraced not because of anything he did politically, but because he committed what in New Orleans at the time were called crimes against nature. And in particular, his involvement with young boys and their running away from home and coming to him and all of this. And David Ferry was a CIA contract pilot who flew missions into Cuba, burning the sugarcane fields, exfiltrating people, infiltrating other people. And around him, he had a group of young boys who had joined something called the Civil Air Patrol, which Ferry led. And among those boys was Lee Harvey Oswald. So a relationship existed between Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferry dating from the 1950s, before Oswald joined the Marines. So now we're coming to the late September, perhaps, of 1963. At a party at David Ferry's house called a gathering, we see Clay Shaw. Lee Harvey Oswald is present during that evening, only he's called Leon, which he was on several occasions in this story. And they're discussing the assassination of President Kennedy. In particular, Shaw and David Ferry are discussing what their alibis would be for November 22nd, 1963. And they're doing this in the hearing of a young man named Perry Russo, who was one of David Ferry's acolytes, perhaps, and is sitting there listening. And eventually, only after David Ferry died, under mysterious circumstances. It's really not clear of what he died, but he died on February 22nd, 1967. And the following week, Perry Russo came forward and wanted to tell his story to the sheriff in Baton Rouge. And the sheriff's office in Baton Rouge didn't want to hear it. And they said, go to the newspapers. And so Perry Russo went to a Baton Rouge newspaper and told about David Ferry. Didn't talk about Shaw at that moment, but he did talk about Ferry. And Garrison's investigators in New Orleans read the newspaper, and Mumu Chambra, who was one of Garrison's people, drove up to Baton Rouge the next day to talk to Perry Russo. And it was then, on that Saturday, that Perry Russo told Andrew Chambra about the party at David Ferry's, in which Ferry and Clay Shaw discussed what their alibis would be for the day of the assassination. These alibis turned out to be true. David Ferry was in Hammond at Southeast Louisiana University, and Clay Shaw was in San Francisco during the assassination. So both of them found it turned out to be true. Garrison immediately had Perry Russo take sodium pentothal to see if he was telling the truth. Really, they did that. They knew the evidence, and they did that just to check. And Russo said the same things. Before the sodium pentothal test, and this was something that I discovered, Perry Russo sat before a police artist, and he described the people that he saw at David Ferry's apartment. In particular, he described the man who called himself Clem Bertrand, and Clay Bertrand was the alias of Clay Shaw. And as Perry Russo described this person, the artist was a police officer, drew the picture, and it turned out to be an exact likeness of Clay Shaw. Now, you might wonder whether that police artist who has come forward here for the first time was telling the truth. But the fact that he turns out to be the person to whom my book is dedicated, a New Orleans police officer who first walked the beat on Bourbon Street, later was part of New Orleans Police Intelligence, still later was one of the members of Team 3, the Louisiana investigators who worked for the United States for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and a police officer of impeccable record named Robert Burris. And Robert Burris, his ambition in life was to be an artist, but because he grew up in the projects and was poor, and his dad was an alcoholic, and he had nothing, he had to become a policeman. But it wasn't what he actually wanted to be an artist. And so he is the person who drew that likeness of Clay Shaw.
Well, Joan, this is incredibly important, and you have a chapter in your book called An Operative in Action, which details the intelligence role of Clay Shaw. And in it, you quote Clay Shaw at a press conference on March 2nd of 1967, the day after Jim Garrison arrested him, that Clay Shaw said explicitly, "I did not know Harvey Lee Oswald," referring to Lee Harvey Oswald, and that he had never met Mr. Dave Ferry. And here you have tied them all together. Not only that, you go into Shaw's recruiting of Guy Bannister, of whom I'd like you to speak also, in a program called, is it Kenchan?
QK Enchant.
It's QKENCHANT. And then also you uncovered that Clay Shaw was not just a CIA employee, that he was particularly an agent, and you have John Whitten, a longtime officer in clandestine services, in charge of reviewing counterintelligence operations. You have him discussing actually the files of Clay Shaw, even though these files were purged. And if I can read from your book, on page 143, it says, "Far from being a mere asset for the domestic contact service, Clay Shaw was a CIA operative. His records resided with counterintelligence, Arthur Dooley of the Counterintelligence Research and Analysis Staff, headed by Raymond Roker, nicknamed The Rock, by Chief James Angleton. One-day telephone John P. Dempsey, the Director of Research. Dooley revealed how well aware he was of Clay Laverne Shaw. He did not bother with the fantasy of attaching an ending date to Clay Shaw's counterintelligence service." Remarkable research.
Joan, with respect to the Central Intelligence Agency high-level role of Clay Shaw over a substantial period of time, we also have the evidence concerning the CIA history of Lee Harvey Oswald at Atsugi Air Force Base, and with his false defection to the Soviet Union, and with his subsequent return. run by the CIA, FBI, and so on.
Well, let me just mention one point, because you said so many things. We have to get back to who Guy Bannister was as well. But one of the points that I think is worth making is that Fair Play for Cuba itself was heavily infiltrated by the CIA, and in particular was a project of the propaganda specialist David Atlee Phillips. So it was no accident that Oswald was standing there on Canal Street and also in front of the International Trade Mart, where Clay Shaw were giving out his leaflets for Fair Play for Cuba. And I also want to mention that although it was known, I think I prove without any doubt that Oswald was working for more than one agency, working for United States Customs, and those files, let me add right here, have not been opened, although it would seem that at the National Archives we have all the records of the Church Committee and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. In fact, all of the records at the Church Committee, which show that Oswald was working closely with U.S. Customs, still remain sealed to this day. However, the summaries exist, and that's where I got the information, because the summaries of those interviews can be found at the National Archives.
By agencies, you're referring to the CIA, the FBI, and the U.S. Customs.
Now, Maya. Now, as far as the FBI is concerned, the Warren Commission knew about that, and that was how Jim Garrison started on his investigation. And I think it's interesting to mention that throughout his life, including in his books, Garrison always said that it was Russell Long, Senator Russell Long, who was the son of the Huey Long, who first got him on to investigating the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and this wasn't true at all. In fact, the person who inspired Jim Garrison, and Garrison kept this secret because he didn't want to blow his cover, was Louisiana Representative Hale Boggs. Hale Boggs was a member of the Warren Commission, and Hale Boggs was present during one of the closed sessions of the Warren Commission at which FBI records of Lee Harvey Oswald were discussed. And Alan Dulles, who was also on the Warren Commission, the CIA director whom John F. Kennedy had fired, had told all the Warren commissioners that none of this must ever leave the room. And, of course, the first thing that Hale Boggs did was to tell Jim Garrison about Oswald's connection to the FBI. And hearing that, Garrison realized that the investigation that he had begun in 1963 when he questioned David Ferry during the weekend of the assassination turned out to be something that the Warren Commission had not investigated at all, and that he really should resume his investigation. One of the people whom I interviewed at great length was the FBI clerk, William Walter. And I think he's one of the most important witnesses. He was deposed before the House Select Committee, who tried to discredit him at every turn, and I think that William Walter stood up well under that questioning, and I think he's an entirely credible witness. William Walter was a young Tulane student in 1963, and during the summer when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested on Canal Street for a skirmish that he had with members of a Cuban organization called DRE, which was the Directorate of Students, Oswald was arrested and taken to jail, where he was questioned by Lieutenant Francis Martello. And Oswald told Lieutenant Martello, call the FBI and tell them that you have Lee Harvey Oswald here. Actually, I think he said Lee Oswald. Now, Martello never talked about this, and he only did so many, many years later in the 1990s. Well, Martello telephoned the FBI. The person who answered the telephone was William Walter. And William Walter, it was, I guess, late at night, maybe on the weekend, and there was only one FBI agent present. His name was John Quigley, and Quigley immediately told Walter to see if they had any files on Lee Harvey Oswald, and of course the place was filled with files, including a file that was in the sealed filing cabinet of the special agent in charge down there. And there it became clear that Lee Harvey Oswald was part of FBI operations in New Orleans. This was a security file that was kept in a locked cabinet. There were also informant files. And on the jacket of Lee Harvey Oswald's security file was the name of a very well-known FBI agent down there in New Orleans called Warren DeBruys, who until this day, and I've spoken to him maybe 2 months ago, denies that he ever knew Oswald, although he did say to me something that he never said before. What he said was, I wouldn't be a very intelligent man if I never changed my mind. And I'll take that as an admission by Warren DeBruys, because otherwise he was the toughest. Although he was not the special agent in charge, he was the toughest of the FBI agents down there. Anyway, there's Oswald's Relationship with the FBI spelled out beyond a doubt. The CIA records do not reveal that Oswald was part of the false defector program that went into the Soviet Union, but it was pretty clear that he was. All the evidence points to that.
Well, let's take a moment to look at the intelligence relationships here. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee at the time was a one-person operation, Lee Harvey Oswald, but it was operating out of a particular location. And it was a building that had offices of somebody named Guy Bannister, which was a clearinghouse for intelligence operations. You have here a convergence of Guy Bannister, Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, and in various circumstances, Jack Ruby as well. The convergence of the central figures in the planning and implementation of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Would you expand upon your own documentation of this with witnesses and documents?
Well, first, I think we have to tell the audience who Guy Bannister was. Guy Bannister had been the special agent in charge of the FBI office in Chicago, which, of course, was the mafia stronghold. He came to New Orleans where, as a cover, he joined the police department and became, and I can't recall his exact title, but he got into a drunken rage once in a bar and he took out his gun and whatnot, and he was fired from the police department. He ran what was supposedly a detective agency at 531 Lafayette Street. And the side entrance of that building, now the United States Courthouse at 500 Camp Street, but the side entrance is 544 Camp Street. And Lee Harvey Oswald stamped 544 Camp Street on some of the leaflets that he gave out for Fair Play for Cuba. And this created quite a disturbance. When Jim Garrison started his investigation, he took note of that. And it was Garrison sitting in his office one day with several Cubans who were helping him who said, "Wait a minute, what number camp? What number camp?" And we have this on tape because the district attorney's office taped that session, and then Garrison realized that Oswald actually was operating out of the offices of Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was in close touch with the FBI, with the CIA. He sent jeeps to Cuba. He was involved in anti-Castro activities. He was involved in collecting ammunition for an invasion of Cuba. He was involved in supplying money from the CIA to the training camps, training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba north of Lake Pontchartrain. All these names are so familiar now, aren't they? And Oswald had an office on the second floor of Bannister's office. And Bannister also had files on everybody, anti-communist files, and one of the young men who was a spy for Bannister and infiltrating left-wing organizations noticed Oswald on the street. Noticed first Oswald in Bannister's office, and then noticed Oswald in the street giving out pro-Castro leaflets. And he said, well, you know, what's going on here? And Bannister said, and I think Garrison did discover that well, he's one of us. Don't worry about him. He's one of us. So it's fairly clear that Oswald was connected with these agencies. Bannister was connected with these agencies. Both were connected with the plots that the CIA had been running to murder Fidel Castro. I don't know if how far we should go with that. Now, Garrison began his investigation with a New Orleans character named Jack Martin. And Jack Martin was working part-time with Guy Bannister. Jack Martin therefore knew David Ferry, and he knew that Oswald was seen in Guy Bannister's office. And so when President Kennedy was assassinated, Jack Martin started telling everyone in New Orleans, wait a minute, David Ferry, who was a resident here in New Orleans, knew Lee Harvey Oswald, the killer of President Kennedy, very well. And that started Jim Garrison's investigation in 1963. Now, when Garrison resumed his investigation in 1966 and 1967, one of the first people he called in was Jack Martin. And I think if the people who have seen the movie JFK, they'll remember Jack Martin was played by Jack Lemmon, and they might remember the scene in which Guy Bannister pistol whips Jack Martin for something, for stealing a file from his office, which turns out to have been true and may very well have been the Lee Harvey Oswald file that Guy Bannister had kept. One of the discoveries that I made, and I want to give thanks to one of the people who helped me find these documents, whose name is Malcolm Blunt and who lives in England. One of the documents that I found was that document in which Bannister is recruited by QK Enchan. Now, QK Enchan was a CIA project, and it permitted a CIA asset or employee to recruit other people who were not part of the CIA for CIA projects. Many people who have defended Clay Shaw have said, oh well, QK Enchan was just something about debriefing people, debriefing businessmen, and that really isn't true. It was a project that involved CIA operatives who were given the authority to recruit people who were not part of the agency.
Well, Joan, you have August 1960 that Shaw is recruiting a Guy Bannister. And you write, a recently uncovered secret CIA document reveals that Guy Bannister Associates was of interest to the agency for QK Enchan purposes.
Let me interrupt you a minute, Maya. I forgot to mention, there's so much material to cover, and that is that it required some effort to prove that Clay Shaw knew Guy Bannister, that these were people who were part of the same operation. Now, I have a witness named Alan Campbell who worked for Guy Bannister who told me that, of course, Guy Bannister used to meet with Clay Shaw frequently, but the significance of that document is if Guy Bannister were in fact recruited for QK Enchan, well, the only member of QK Enchan in New Orleans was Clay Shaw. So there we have the connection between Guy Bannister and Clay Shaw confirmed by by a document itself.
Today, we're speaking with author Joan Mellen, investigator Joan Mellen, who has prepared the most incredible, compelling book, A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History. This is the first interview with Joan for the release of her book. WBAI is very fortunate today to have Joan with us here in the studio. Ralph?
Well, I want to emphasize here, because we've been dwelling on some of the particulars, and the particulars are of great significance, not only because key witnesses come forward and Joan has unearthed the corroborating documents. She's ferreted them out. She's got them out of people who had been hoarding them and hiding them. She solicited them and covered them from files that had not been labeled as such. But let's put this in its larger context, brothers and sisters. Clay Shaw, CIA. Lee Harvey Oswald, CIA. David Ferry, CIA. Guy Bannister, CIA. Jack Ruby, FBI and CIA. They're not just a team on their own. As Joan's book elucidates, and as her documentation and her interviews and her time spent with the actual culprits makes clear, we're talking about the top echelons of the Central Intelligence Agency and of military intelligence. David Atlee Phillips, the head of station throughout Latin America. Richard Helms, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency himself. James Jesus Angleton, the head of counterintelligence and with the Defense Intelligence Agency. All of this emerges from this book irrefutably with overwhelming documentation. It's not just a vindication of Jim Garrison, but it's the documentation beyond any question of the treason at the top that the Kennedy execution represents. This is an extraordinary document. It's going to remain such for decades. I urge you to buy it. For an extraordinary achievement, 8 years in the making, that in my judgment is the most significant investigative work that I've come across.
While we're so lucky to have Joan with us for the 3 hours today, we can only touch upon the incredible research, the remarkable detail, and there are almost 100 pages of very tiny print of notes to accompany, to let you know where exactly she got each piece of information, and every sentence is a new discovery in this book. And also the dates of her interviews. It is a remarkable scholarly work as well as an investigative tour de force. A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History. And we're telling you this is a work that will change history.
Well, let's be very clear about this, brothers and sisters. The enshrining of a coup d'etat and the execution of the head of state, and the installation of the heads of the intelligence agencies and the Joint Chiefs and the military services in effecting the murder of the president sets the stage for the criminalization of the state and all that has followed. The 9/11 false flag, the series of incidents from the catastrophe of Katrina to the false flag of 9/11 flows from the criminalization of the state and its capture, and this is the book that sets the documentation forth without any question. It is essential that we make this information available, that we not just make it available, but that we emphasize its significance. The book itself draws all of its appropriate conclusions. Please, this is a document that you will read 10 times and still discover new information in it. And all of the political implications are clearly drawn, without any hesitation, drawn from the evidence, drawn from the massive interviewing, documentation, and disclosure, revelationary disclosures, brothers and sisters. A Farewell to Justice. This is the Jim Garrison JFK investigation and the case that should have changed history by Joan Mellen. It is a definitive work on the Kennedy execution. Of the hundreds of books that have appeared on this subject, nothing even begins to approach the extraordinary revelations that come forward in this book that leave no question remaining as to how Kennedy was killed and who did it and why. Keep the information coming, brothers and sisters. The struggles ahead will depend upon the kind of revelations that we're able to find and to make our own by acquiring A Farewell to Justice by Joan Mellen.
I wanted to say something. Can I interrupt mine?
Oh, of course.
I first of all want to thank WBAI for the opportunity to discuss this book in such a way without any hesitation for this length of time and to explore the ideas. I can't think of any other station in the country where this would be possible, and I didn't know that you call it free speech radio, but that's certainly what it is, and I'm extremely grateful for that. I think it's extremely rare, increasingly rare, and I can't applaud WBAI enough. I'd also like to mention that there are other aspects of the social history of the United States of the 1960s in this book, as well as the discussion of the assassination of President Kennedy. One of those is the civil rights movement and the efforts of CORE, especially, it turned out, in that little town of Clinton, Louisiana, in the summer of 1963, when Lee Harvey Oswald went up there with Clay Shaw and David Ferry. It turned out that Oswald stood on line to register to vote in the middle of a CORE registration drive, and that was an extremely important registration drive because in East Feliciana Parish in Louisiana, I think they only had 10 African-American voters on the rolls during that time. Very, very, you couldn't vote. And here's the registrar of voters in East Feliciana Parish had a doll with a noose around its neck on his door. And he also had in his office one of those anti-civil rights movement, I don't know what to call it, the vicious posters against Martin Luther King, in which it was Martin Luther King at the communist school in Tennessee. And one of the great efforts in the state of Louisiana to avoid integration was to suggest that the civil rights movement was infiltrated by communists. And there's the registrar of voters up there in East Feliciana Parish, Henry Earl Palmer, with that poster, and the same poster appeared in the barbershop of Leah McGee, where Lee Harvey Oswald went to have a haircut on that trip up there, and ultimately became his visit to the hospital to apply for a job.
And Joan, didn't you speak to McGee?
Oh, I spoke to McGee as recently as 2 days ago. He's still alive. I also spoke, and I think a much more important person for me was the chairman of CORE in East Feliciana Parish, a man named Corey Collins. And this is a person who was a Vietnam veteran who was not given the right to vote. And Henry Earl Palmer told Corey Collins, well, you fail. Well, why did he fail? Because he answered all the questions on the exam correctly, and you only had to answer, I think, 6 out of the 10. And so he failed for that. And then there was a period of time that elapsed before you could go back and register again, and Corey Collins went back and, of course, registered to vote. One of the things that I found out about the stereotypes that we have about the South, have to be adjusted a little bit. Corey Collins was so courageous that he stood up to the Klan at every chance, and he knew where they met. They used to meet at a TV repair shop, and he'd go in there when he saw all the cars outside, so he knew the Klan was meeting, and he would go in there just to show that he knew that they should know that he knew that the Klan was meeting. And he was extremely courageous, extremely forceful, and Corey Collins was one of the people who came down to New Orleans in February of 1969 to testify at the trial of Clay Shaw, and to show that Clay Shaw certainly had lied when he said that he didn't know Oswald, or Ferry, more to the point, Oswald, because Corey Collins was one of what were called the Clinton witnesses. And what Corey Collins told me, and he never told Jim Garrison, Corey Collins worked for the post office in Baton Rouge at the time of Garrison's investigation, and as a result of his testifying for Jim Garrison, Corey Collins was fired by the United States Post Office. They had written to him on saying he had to be at work on Saturday morning when they knew he couldn't possibly get back up there in time to be at work. And he was fired, and he never told Garrison. And I said, well, why didn't you tell Garrison? And he was just so stoical, and he didn't want to bother Garrison with the fact that he'd been fired from his job because he testified at the trial of Clay Shaw. And one of the great sadnesses for me was that Corey Collins died a year ago this month, in October, and so would not ever read the book. And I call him an unsung hero, which is the title of chapter 14. And Corey Collins faced down lynch mobs, and one time they removed somebody from a jail. They were going to lynch somebody, and he got there, and he said, by the time I get there, he better be back in jail. They better leave him where he was, and they did. And later, when some of Clay Shaw's friends went up there and tried to intimidate Corey Collins' father, he exposed them, and he knew as liars, because they said that a deputy sheriff had pointed out the Collins house, and Corey Collins said, well, the deputy sheriff knew, and of course this is a racist who's used words that we won't use on WBAI today, but he said he knew that Corey Collins had told all the so-called law enforcement up there, bother me, not him, referring to his father. And I think that Emmett Collins, that was Corey Collins' father, died the previous June, and Corey Collins was on dialysis throughout the time that I knew him, and he stayed alive through that summer after his father died, and then he died himself, as I said, in October.
We should remind people the CORE is the Congress of Racial Equality, and at the time of which Joan is speaking, there were tests in the South. You had to pass a voter registration test before you could register. This was one of the great struggles to eliminate the tests and allow people to register as citizens of the United States.
But I think it's important to emphasize here that what emerges in the identifying of Oswald and Clinton and his presence there with Clay Shaw and with David Ferry is that they were running Oswald up there to take him into the mental hospital and to create the paper trail for the later setting up of Oswald as patsy. And that the significance of this is that, as Joan elucidates in her book, they were preparing the cover story even before the execution of Kennedy himself. And
well, that's extremely important, Ralph, because it shows that if the cover-up began before the crime, then you can certainly say that the same people who did the cover-up also did the crime. And many people have tried to say, well, it's so obvious that the CIA covered up what happened in the assassination, but is it clear that they were involved in the crime? And, of course, here we see the two processes being identical.
The witnesses that established that, I mean, let's just take James Wilcox, who was with Oswald at Atsugi Air Force Base and was with the Central Intelligence Agency, and whose own testimony about Oswald's role and the role of the Central Intelligence Agency and the role that was assigned to Oswald as the fake Marxist, the Fidelista, who was the presumptive assassin that would facilitate the invasion of Cuba in the aftermath of the Kennedy execution.
I wanted to correct one small point regarding the component of the CIA that was involved in the assassination. And I think it's the people that seem to be involved here. First of all, of course, the legal offices of the CIA in Lawrence, Houston are present throughout this. But primarily it was the clandestine service and not, I would say, the several other components. For example, people in the Soviet realities section, which should have been notified about Oswald's presence in the Soviet Union and were not informed. And I think even one might question whether the clandestine service, which at that time was led by Richard Helms, he was deputy director for plans, and plans meant dirty operations or the clandestine service. It's not even clear whether John McCone, who was director of Central Intelligence at the time, was informed. And I think we know the phrase now, plausible deniability, that it would be, I think they thought, much better that he not know. And I think Helms pretty much admitted when he testified before the Church Committee, that there was a great deal of information that they never shared with John McCone, precisely so that he could say that he didn't know about this or that, and that he really didn't know, and that he would be telling the truth. And I think it's very likely that the same was true for the Kennedy assassination itself.
Well, now, Joan, let's talk for a moment about the revelations that occurred in the Italian newspaper Paesi Sera, which had been carrying out an investigation in Italy during the late 60s into the Central Intelligence Agency role in Italy in preparing the potential military putsch in Italy that did in fact occur in Greece, and in what was later disclosed to be something called Operation Gladio, the 40-year subversion of the political process in Italy and staging operations. One of the things that emerged from that series of investigative reports in Paesi Sera was the proprietary company Centro Mondiale Commerciale, World Trade Mart, with a figure named Clay Shaw, and another operation of the Central Intelligence Agency called Permanent Industrial Expositions, or Permindex. As you know, I sent those materials to Jim Garrison at the time, and you and I had occasion to interview the editors and the participants in that study a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I wanted to make that point. You made it for me, but I was going to make that point, that Jim Garrison didn't have the CIA files of Clay Shaw that we have today. But through Ralph's efforts, Ralph was in London at the time working on the Who Killed Kennedy Committee, and also was executive director of the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation. And at that time, Ralph became friendly with the Italian correspondent from Paesi Sera to London named Giorgio Fanti. And through Fanti, Ralph received the series of articles that appeared in Paesi Sera, which had to do with the role of the CIA in electoral politics in several countries, particularly France and Italy after the war. And what should be written, and to the surprise of the Paesi Sera editors, was that on the board of Permindex, which was the main organization, and then that CMC in Rome, was Clay Shaw. And so it had been difficult to prove, number one, that the CMC and Permindex were CIA projects, but also that Clay Shaw was enlisted by the heads of those organizations to be on the board of directors, which would be an American Central Intelligence Agency asset endorsing those activities in Europe. One of the documents that I received shows, it's a CIA document from 1948, and it showed that Ferenc Nagy, who was one of the leaders of Permindex, was and had been CIA asset since the early days of the CIA, since its inception really in 1947 and in 1948.
Well, aren't we talking as well here with the involvement of Guy Bannister and in the activities of Permindex and of Clay Shaw and the Centro Mondiale Commerciale, not only what led to the assassination of Kennedy, but an elaborate plan to support the fascists in France who were involved in the OAS in Algeria, Jacques Soustelle, and the planned assassination of Charles de Gaulle.
That's right. When the CIA could not influence the elections in these European countries through spending money and giving money to the political parties whom the CIA wanted to support, they supported assassination attempts. And as you say, Ralph, against de Gaulle, and certainly they were very big supporters of the OAS, which are this fascist torture organization, which you can see trying to prevent the liberation of Algeria from France, and that you see in Gillo Pontecorvo's film, The Battle of Algiers.
We're speaking with author Joan Mellen, and we're discussing her soon-to-be-released book, A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History. This is a book that will change history because it elucidates and it uncovered new information that confirms without a doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was not a loner, but a government agent who worked for the CIA, the New Orleans FBI office, and U.S. Customs, that he worked closely and connected to the CIA-sponsored anti-Castro figures in New Orleans, including Clay Shaw, of whom we've been speaking, David Ferry, and a Cuban associate of Shaw's at the International Trade Mart named Juan Valdez. Clay Shaw and David Ferry, both Garrison suspects and CIA operatives, implemented the assassination. They helped frame Oswald as the murderer.
Let me point out that Joan, over the period of nearly 8 years, interviewed 1,000 people. 1,000 people. She ferreted out every last associate of the people involved in the execution of Kennedy. She not only did that, but tens of thousands of documents were searched and perused, and documents that produced snippets of information in each document, each of them explosive. This is integrated now in a seamless depiction of the unfolding of this execution and its instruction from the highest levels. Joan, talk a moment about Maurice Bishop and Lee Harvey Oswald, and who is Maurice Bishop? Joan, talk a moment about Maurice Bishop and Lee Harvey Oswald, and who is Maurice Bishop?
Maurice Bishop is the name, one of the aliases that David Atlee Phillips took. And it was an unusual moment when one of the leaders of the Cuban exile anti-Castro movement, Antonio Veciana, testified, or rather, I shouldn't say that he testified, but he revealed to the Miami investigator Gaten Fonzi that he had seen his own handler, Bishop, which was Phillips, talking to Lee Harvey Oswald. And it was a rare moment that, but then we also have evidence that David Atlee Phillips was seen at the training camps north of Lake Pontchartrain with David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald and others. So I wanted to get back, though, Ralph, to one other point about Jim Garrison and the Italian newspaper Paese Sera, and that is that in the last 5 years, there have been renewed attacks on Jim Garrison. And one of those attacks has said that the only reason that Garrison charged the CIA with having been responsible for the murder of President Kennedy was that he read about this in Paese Sera. And the Paese Sera was blaming the CIA for its interference in European politics only as a result of disinformation sent by the KGB. And one of the things that I had to do then was to go to the surviving editors of Paese Sera and ask them whether it was in fact true that they were targeting the CIA only as a result of the instruction of the KGB. And one of the people I found was a man named Gianfranco Corsini, who was absolutely indignant that the KGB could have influenced this newspaper, and I like what he said to me. We have no reason to trust new CIA documents any more than old KGB documents. And he said that he hoped for the demise of both the CIA and the KGB. Well, that's prescient, isn't it? Because the CIA today is not what it was in John F. Kennedy's time.
Well, I should mention in regard to that, this is Max Holland, who is on the editorial board of The Nation, but is what we call a CIA writer. He actually writes for the CIA website, and it's Holland who has fabricated this ridiculous claim that Paese Sera was a vehicle for the KGB. The irony of it all is that Paese Sera, which is a newspaper of the independent left, it was not tied to the Italian Communist Party, and so what if it had been? But Paese Sera is rather analogous to The Nation itself, ironically enough. But it was Sartre wrote for Paese Sera, Simone de Beauvoir. It was a vehicle of the independent left intelligentsia across Europe and the United States. It was a daily newspaper with a very substantial following. And this investigative report was concerned with the role of the CIA in Italy. It's only quite fortuitously that they stumbled upon the presence of figures like Clay Shaw on the board of directors of these proprietary Central Intelligence Agency companies that were in Italy.
We're speaking with Joan Mellen, author of this remarkable investigative work, A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History. One thing you tracked down to talk about Clay Shaw is that, as I mentioned earlier, Shaw denied that he ever knew David Ferry. And in your book, you mention that Ferry, in order to rent the plane to go to Dallas, that he actually took out a loan, and it was co-signed by Clay Shaw.
Maya, that was one of the biggest discoveries that I made, and I made it because I don't know how now looking back, there was a retired police officer who was the founder of, I think, the Policemen's Union named Irv Magri. And he said, you have to talk to this former policeman from Kenner because he knows something. And it turned out that this former policeman from Kenner knew a loan officer named Herb Wagner, who had also been with the Civil Air Patrol, knew Ferry very, very well, and also flew missions for the CIA. And one day during Garrison's investigation, Herb Wagner was sitting in his office late at night with this police officer, and he said, I have something, and I wonder whether I should tell Jim Garrison. And he opens up a file drawer at the bottom of the, way in the back. He reaches into this file drawer, and he pulls out a loan application. And here's David Ferry, only several weeks before the assassination, applying for a loan. And when Wagner, who was called Von Wagner by everyone, very dramatic, and he would not give Ferry the loan, and there's Clay Shaw's signature as the co-signer, showing not only that the two knew each other, but that they were collaborating on this flight that Ferry took to Dallas 2 weeks or maybe even 1 week before the assassination. Now, I want to add here a fact, and that is that when David Ferry was interviewed by the FBI and the Secret Service right after the assassination, he said that he hadn't been in Dallas between 8 and 10 years. So obvious lie. Of course, Ferry was never interviewed by the Warren Commission, or, well, he was dead by the time of the House Select Committee investigation. But that loan document, I tried to find the actual document because wouldn't that be wonderful to have it? And Wagner had died, and all of his files were put in garbage bags, and his wife diligently threw them all away. And so I asked his daughter to go through her garage, see if possibly that file could have survived, but I have to say that it didn't. So I do have the testimony of the police officer and of his daughter, certainly of his daughter, as to his CIA connections.
Now, we're talking here about a relationship between Clay Shaw and David Ferry, who was a contract pilot for the Central Intelligence Agency as well as for Carlos Marcello of the mob, and a contract pilot who flew operations of sabotage and of carrying agents in and out of Cuba to attack Cuba.
I want to stop you for 1 second, Ralph. And David Ferry was not really Carlos Marcello's pilot. David Ferry worked for G. Ray Gill, who was the lawyer of Carlos Marcello. And Gill had represented Ferry when Ferry was fired from his job as a pilot for Eastern Airlines, and Ferry couldn't pay Gill. So as a favor to Gill, Ferry flew Carlos Marcello. He flew him back from Guatemala to the United States. He got a passport for Marcello and taped it to his chest and all of this. But it's very misleading to try to draw particular mafia connections between David Ferry and Carlos Marcello. That wasn't the case. One of the things that I discover in the book, and I think this is extremely important, is where the story originated that the mafia had been involved in the planning of the assassination of President Kennedy, because that was the second line of defense. It was certainly the second line of defense for the House Select Committee once they received acoustic evidence that showed that there were more than 3 shots fired in Dealey Plaza. That made it impossible for Oswald to have been the single assassin. So if it were a conspiracy, which is more than 2 people involved, then the House Select Committee Chief Counsel, Robert Blakey, put forth the view, well, it had to be the mafia. That view that the mafia was involved in planning the assassination was a brainstorm of J. Edgar Hoover's and the FBI. And I think in the book I show exactly how that happened. The other side of that was to blame Garrison for supporting the mafia. That was the other way of discrediting Garrison. Hoover also thought of that, and he thought a good way to discredit Garrison would be that he protected Carlos Marcello. Now, Carlos Marcello operated out of Jefferson Parish, not out of Orleans Parish. It didn't make any difference. If enough reporters would write it, if enough people would say it, it could be true. Hoover was a master. And so even as recently as when I did my own investigation, people would say to me that Garrison protected Carlos Marcello. It certainly wasn't true. Now, everybody knows everyone in New Orleans, or knew everyone. And certainly Garrison knew Marcello, partly because one of Marcello's many lawyers was Russell Sharnicus, with whom Garrison practiced law, if you could call it that, because Garrison never liked to practice law. And after he lost his job as district attorney, he would occasionally go into the office, and mostly he provided referrals. And so Marcello appeared at that office now and then, and everybody knew everyone. Even my own doctor here in New York City at Mount Sinai Hospital, who was studying medicine at Tulane University, during these days once told me that he'd ran into Carlos Marcello at a funeral, that he was standing at the back at this funeral chatting with a man, and when he sat down there's Dr. Carmel Cohn, one of the great doctors of the universe, and one of his friends said, "Do you know who you were talking to back there?" That was Carlos Marcello. So if the gynecologist from Mount Sinai Hospital knew Carlos Marcello or was seen talking to him, you can be sure everybody in Orleans Parish did too.
Well,
but Garrison did not help the mafia. And when Robert Blakey and his deputy Gary Cornwell tried to connect the mafia to the assassination, I should say that even Aaron Cohn, one of Garrison's bitterest enemies, the head of the Metropolitan Crime Commission, had defended the FBI and said they did not protect the mafia. The mafia had nothing to do with it, and Oswald's family weren't even so much involved with the mafia as Blakey and his co-author Richard Billings would have you believe.
Well, let's go into some of the means that were used, like you've been talking about now, but the means to discredit the Garrison investigation and Garrison personally. One of your remarkable chapters in the book, I mean, every chapter is remarkable, but one I particularly found so dramatic and engaging was Chapter 12, White Paper, where you talk about Justice Department lawyer Walter Sheridan and how, at Bobby Kennedy's request, Sheridan orchestrated an NBC white paper and also the penetration of Garrison's office.
Before we talk about Walter Sheridan, we have to say who Walter Sheridan was. He was part of the National Security Agency, cleared for the CIA, cleared for the FBI. So he represented many agencies before he went to work primarily for Robert Kennedy at the Justice Department. And what Walter Sheridan's big project was not, first it was not Jim Garrison, it was to destroy Jimmy Hoffa. And three remarkable articles appeared by Fred Cook in The Nation magazine, which exposed exactly what Sheridan did. He used his three favorite methods: wiretapping, blackmail, and bribery, and he managed to get Hoffa convicted. He lied, he cheated, he did and he was the head of what was called Robert Kennedy's wiretapping unit. And Sheridan succeeded. Hoffa was convicted. And the coda to that story is so appalled was Chief Justice Earl Warren that he when the Hoffa conviction came up before the United States Supreme Court for review, Earl Warren dissented and wanted to let Hoffa go because of the methods that Walter Sheridan used. He was an absolute thug. He was a criminal himself. Now, he's finished with Hoffa. What does he do? He's sent down to New Orleans to destroy Jim Garrison. Before he gets there, he establishes credentials. He's suddenly a producer for NBC television. He had produced one other thing in Detroit in order to pave the way, and the CIA assets down there, such as Hugh Ainsworth, who was working for Newsweek magazine at the time, Ainsworth wrote an article about Sheridan in which he mentioned Sheridan as a reporter and as a news producer 4 times in the space of a 1-page article. Okay, here comes Sheridan. He comes down to New Orleans and pretends to be investigating the Kennedy assassination, and what he's doing is destroying the Garrison investigation. And the product would be this white paper, which did in fact appear on NBC. What Sheridan tried to do, and he failed to do, the one thing he failed to do was to destroy Garrison's chief witness, whom we talked about earlier, Perry Rousseau. And he tried to bribe Rousseau, and he tried to tell Rousseau, I'll get you a job in Los Angeles. Where would you like to go? California. All you have to do is to say that everything that you told Jim Garrison was a lie. Well, this is extremely interesting because the Shaw defense went to great lengths to discredit Perry Rousseau. It could only be because they believed that what he said was true. And Rousseau had testified at a preliminary hearing. Now, Garrison had called a preliminary hearing on the evidence, which he didn't have to do. Usually it's the defense that calls a preliminary hearing, but Garrison wanted to show what his evidence was. And I should mention for the people who are legal-minded that at the time in the state of Louisiana, the prosecution did not have to give its witness list to the defense. So here's Garrison exposing his chief witness, Perry Rousseau, to the public and gave the other side a chance for 2 years to attempt to destroy him. And that was what Walter Sheridan went to New Orleans to do.
Well, this shows the collaboration of NBC, the network itself, with Attorney General Robert Kennedy and the FBI to prevent the real investigation of the Kennedy assassination.
Well, more than that, to destroy the witnesses, to threaten them with death, to threaten them with prison, to blackmail them, to bribe them, to use any method possible.
Well, Russo was a very courageous young fellow. He worked for an insurance company. He was quite a character. And he immediately went into Garrison's office and signed an affidavit. Garrison knew that Sheridan and James Phelan, who was another media asset who was reporting to the FBI and the CIA, Garrison knew that these people were getting at Russo. And so what happened, and maybe Garrison was wrong to do this, but he wired Russo so that everything that happened there was on tape. So as a result of that, I have the tapes of Sheridan's attempts and Phelan's attempts to subvert Perry Russo. Perry Russo was strong. Perry Russo did not cave in. In fact, he went to the district attorney's office and signed an affidavit against Sheridan. Garrison then indicted Sheridan. Now, being the state of Louisiana in 1967 and 1968, there was no law against obstruction of justice. So Garrison charged Walter Sheridan with various charges, bribery and so forth. And, of course, Sheridan was protected by the federal courts and never went to trial.
You have to summarize, what is it that Russo actually had witnessed? Where was he present? What was he testifying to? And what was it significant?
No, we talked about that a little earlier. What Russo testified to was that meeting at David Ferry's apartment when Clay Shaw, who went under the name of Clem Bertrand, and David Ferry discussed the assassination, how President Kennedy would be killed, and what their alibis would be. Now, I should, at this point, for people who don't remember the Garrison case, talk about what that name Clem or Clay Bertrand meant. And this is, of course, part of the record and even part of the Warren Commission. And that is, on the Saturday after President Kennedy was shot, a New Orleans lawyer, also another mob lawyer named Dean Andrews, was in Hotel Dieu Hospital recovering from pneumonia when he received a telephone call from someone named Clay Bertrand, whom he knew, asking him to go to Dallas to represent Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, Andrews was too sick to go, so and this is corroborated, he called a fellow lawyer named Monk Zeldin, and he asked him to go in his place, go to Dallas and represent Lee Harvey Oswald. And as they were talking in a second conversation on Sunday morning, Zeldin said, "Nobody has to go to Dallas, your boy just got shot." And there's Jack Ruby had killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, when the Warren Commission did talk to Dean Andrews, he never identified Clay Bertrand. And, of course, what Garrison, who knew everyone, of course, Garrison knew Dean Andrews. So the first official interview that Garrison did when he resumed his investigation in 1966 was to have lunch with Dean Andrews and to try to get the identification who was Clay Bertrand. Who was this Bertrand? And at this gathering that we were talking about, at which Perry Russo was present, Clay Shaw, who was Clay Bertrand, and I prove that up and down, although it has been difficult for Garrison to prove, but I prove it, I think, further. Clay Shaw went under the name Clem Bertrand. Now, it turns out, through various research that I did, that name that Clay Shaw used was the alias that he chose as when he was helping fellow homosexuals in New Orleans when they were arrested against these, what were called in those days, crimes against nature. And the irony of that is, of course, that Garrison was a liberal. I want to mention that Garrison was a liberal. He did not want to prosecute anybody. Ferry was prosecuted, by the way, in Jefferson Parish, not in Orleans Parish. He didn't want to prosecute anybody for these victimless crimes. He really didn't care about what people's sexual preferences were. And despite what Jack Anderson wrote in one of his columns, during the trial of Clay Shaw, Garrison never once called a witness who in any way could reveal what Clay Shaw's sexual practices were. I do that in the book, but certainly Garrison never used that. And as a result, Garrison lost many witnesses who could have testified to the fact that Clay Shaw was indeed the Clay Bertrand who telephoned Dean Andrews to ask him to go to Dallas and represent Lee Harvey Oswald.
But also, Sheridan didn't limit himself to trying to get at Perry Russo. He also enlisted Gordon Novell to penetrate Garrison's office. And could you talk some about Gordon?
That's interesting. Gordon Novell remains a New Orleans character, and if you read a recent issue of Vanity Fair, there's a long discussion of Gordon Novell, who's saying that he was an advisor to Michael Jackson in his recent trial. So Gordon Novell is one of a New Orleans character who was available, who was an FBI informant, and whom Sheridan used, as Maya says, to penetrate Garrison's office, to steal documents, to steal lie detector testimonies to photographs, whatever he could get his hands on. And so simultaneously, Gordon Novell was reporting to Walter Sheridan, and he was also reporting every day, really, to the FBI. And thanks to the Oliver Stone and to the JFK Act, we have all of those reports from Gordon Novell to the FBI that are available to everyone in the National Archives. One of the things that Gordon Novell did for Walter Sheridan was put him on to Marlene Mancuso, who was Gordon Novell's ex-wife and who was a Garrison witness. And then Walter Sheridan tried to subvert Marlene Mancuso, also offering her a job on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. She was quite beautiful. She had been a Miss New Orleans. And Walter Sheridan promised that he could get her a job on The Tonight Show if she would take back the testimony that she had given for Jim Garrison.
And what was that testimony?
That testimony had to do with the robbery of the Schlumberger ammunitions dump out in Houma, Louisiana, which was masterminded by Guy Bannister, by Gordon Novell, possibly with David Phillips' authorization, the same David Phillips that Ralph was referring to as Maurice Bishop. And they stole all these grenades and various war material, which they then trucked into New Orleans, ultimately bound for Miami and for the efforts against Fidel Castro.
Joan, David Atlee Phillips was the head of station for Latin America and in particular for Mexico of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, chief of operations for the Western Hemisphere, working very closely with JM Wave, the CIA station in Miami. He wasn't actually chief of station in Mexico City, but that was under his jurisdiction.
And David Atlee Phillips is a central and coordinating figure with respect to the key participants in the execution of John Kennedy.
Certainly David Atlee Phillips was involved. And he wrote his memoirs. It's called The Amlash Legacy, and it's in the form of a novel. And his wife has kept that undercover, but an assassination researcher managed to look at some of it during depositions in a lawsuit. And so we see that David Atlee Phillips depicts himself as Lee Harvey Oswald's handler in his fictionalized version of the Kennedy assassination.
Well, in fact, that fictionalized version of the Kennedy assassination by David Atlee Phillips actually elaborates the entire scenario of setting up a Fidelista as the fall guy for the assassination and then carrying it out as a government operation.
That's right. The CIA's original plan was to blame Fidel Castro for the assassination and that this would precipitate an invasion of Cuba, which was what the CIA and the Pentagon at that time wanted and which John F. Kennedy did not want.
9/11 of the day.
Well, the Vietnam, I mean, in a way, because what happened was that although they did not get there after the death of President Kennedy, they did not get their war in Cuba. They got something even better, which was the protracted war in Vietnam, because so many more profits accumulated to the oil people, the helicopter people, and the Western interests that profited so much from the Vietnam War. And we see these same people profiting, of course, from the Iraq War. One of the interesting things that Garrison wanted to do was to really investigate George Brown and to look at Brown and Root and to see, and he discovered their CIA connections. The documents were not available to Garrison, although they are to us. And so Garrison focused on Brown and Root, and here is Kellogg Brown and Root at the forefront of the, I don't know, is it billions of dollars that they have made from the contracts in Iraq?
Right. We had discussed the development of Brown and Root in our Crony Capitalism series, and Brown is very much connected with Lyndon Baines Johnson. And it was Lyndon Baines Johnson, even when he was in Congress, that got Franklin Delano Roosevelt to award to Brown the original road building and then also dam building monies. And then later it was Brown who promoted Lyndon Baines Johnson in his congressional campaigns. There's very close connections. So
before we go any further, I want to make a point that I do not subscribe to the view that Lyndon Johnson was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
What was interesting to me is that you're saying that Garrison wanted to look further into the role of Kellogg Brown, and then it was Kellogg Brown. Later it became
Brown and Root. I think
Brown
at the time
Root.
it was Brown.
It was Brown and Root, and then later became Kellogg Brown and Root, and then they were part of Halliburton much, much later.
Joan, you discuss a CIA accountant with top secret clearance named James Wilcott, who I mentioned before had been with Oswald at Itsugi, retired in 1966. There's an extraordinary passage here where you cite Wilcott as follows. Oswald received a full-time salary for operational work. There were at least 6 or 7 people who knew and believed Oswald to be an agent of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he concludes, Ruby was paid by the CIA to do away with Oswald. The plan was to kill Kennedy, link Oswald to Castro, and use the pretext to invade Cuba.
I think that's all correct. I think that the House Select Committee attempted to discredit him, attempted to show, well, he couldn't be right because the person he cites was no longer there at the time and so forth. It's pretty lame. I think he was telling the truth. I think because people often say, how come there are no loose ends? How come nobody came forward? How come no one said anything? And the fact is that isn't true. People have said things. There have been loose ends, and that was just an unfortunate for them fact. This man did not testify for Jim Garrison, although I think he would have wanted to.
Well, after all, Joan, after it was disclosed that Jim Garrison was going to indict David Ferry, he was found dead. At the same time, Eladio Del Valle came up with a severe case of hatchet in the head in Miami, in Key Biscayne. Mary Sherman is found dead. How many witnesses, people who had come forward or had guilty knowledge, were silenced and eliminated and disappeared and murdered in the course of this process?
Well, I think certainly the witnesses were afraid. And only last week when I was talking to the barber, Liam McGee, who gave Oswald the haircut, he said, I found the new witness. I found somebody who was interviewed by the FBI right after the assassination, and he was interviewed with a woman named Gladys Palmer, who really should have been one of the Clinton witnesses. She had been a stripper for Jack Ruby at the Carousel Club, and she was seen with Oswald quite frequently during the spring and summer of 1963. And the FBI had thought that this man and Gladys Palmer were quote-unquote boyfriend and girlfriend, and they were taken in to the jailhouse at St. Francisville and questioned by the FBI. And I said, I'd really like to talk to this man. And the barber said, well, he's terrified. He's still terrified to this day.
Give the example of Rose Cheramy.
And then there's Rose Cheramy. Well, Rose Cheramy, of course, was not afraid, and she was at the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson during the day of the Kennedy assassination and predicted the assassination and talked to some Cubans who were with her, and so she knew that the assassination was coming. And before she could be a Garrison witness, she was murdered in 1965 walking on a deserted highway in Big Sandy, Texas. Who would hitchhike on a deserted road instead of a main road? And she was hit by a car and died.
She also said, after all, Rose Cheramy, that she was a stripper or a hooker for Ruby, and then she witnessed Ruby and Oswald together frequently at the Carousel Club.
That was she was one of the witnesses who could show that Ruby and Oswald knew each other. There have been quite a few. My book is chock filled with witnesses who saw Oswald and Ruby together at the Carousel Club and elsewhere.
We're speaking with author Joan Mellen, investigative author of A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History. Joan is decades friend and companion, and we know the methodical way in which he approaches every one of the subjects for which he has written books and analysis, and the way she approaches life.
And what I'm talking about here, brothers and sisters, is a profile in courage. You hear a quiet-spoken, indefatigable author, investigator, researcher, professor who has personally, physically been present with the killers, the contract killers, the plug uglies and the thugs, the actual assassins, sat with them, met with their families, pressed them, pushed them, extracted information from them, extraordinary documentation, first-hand witnesses that people paled before the prospect of even contacting. And there was Joan traveling on her own for almost 8 years from place to place, meeting these people and gaining their confidence and convincing them of the necessity at this point in time to come forward. And she has obtained their data, she has obtained their verification, she has contained, if you like, their first-hand accounts. It is just a breathtaking achievement. And as you read it, you will be astonished at the audacity, the courage, and the perseverance that has produced this extraordinary work.
We have so much more to discuss in terms of the interviews, and particularly the role of Robert Kennedy in sabotaging the investigation, why he would do such a thing, why would he sabotage the investigation of his own brothers, his close brother to whom he was very close in the assassination, and what this means. We're also going to discuss later on in the show the role of the top echelon of the CIA and the involvement of Richard Helms and James Angleton and others in this assassination.
Brothers and sisters, point man for the murder of Patrice Lumumba was a man named Frank Carlucci. The head of the Carlyle Group is a man named Frank Carlucci. A key figure in the Central Intelligence Agency operation that entailed the assassination of John F. Kennedy, a man named Frank Carlucci. A key collaborator of Bush Sr. and Bush Jr., a man named Frank Carlucci. It all comes together here: the murder state, the criminalization of the state, the execution of the head of state, the treason at the top, the detail, the particularity, the eliciting of the witnesses, the establishment of the documents, and the connections, connecting the dots, bringing it all together. A Farewell to Justice by Joan Mellen. You have to have it, brothers and sisters, because it illuminates decades of the decomposition of what passes for the state in this country.
You were talking about Rose Chermy, and then here on page 206 it says, back in New Orleans, Garrison uncovered Rose's 20 aliases. Her name appeared everywhere, but in the Warren Commission index of names, the state police had not taken her photograph or prints. And then you have a person named Fruge. I don't remember.
Francis Fruge. Francis Fruge was a state trooper who ultimately, with Mrs. Dishler, became the investigators for Jim Garrison up at Clinton and Jackson. And Fruge enters the story here because he was a state policeman in charge of narcotics, and so he knew Rose Chermy very well because she plied her trade, prostitution, drugs, on Route 190 down there from Opelousas to the border of Texas in Beaumont, which, again, names that we know because of the recent catastrophes down there. And so when Rose was thrown out of a car, this is the time number one, and she's dazed, she's on drugs, and Francis Fruge is called. That's where the story starts as far as Rose Chermy is concerned. And Francis Fruge is told to take her to the East Louisiana State Hospital. And while Rose is with him, she's talking, and she's telling how Oswald and Ruby knew each other and how the assassination was planned and how she was with the Cubans. And so Francis Fruge enters the story at that time.
And it says here that her death certificate reads, quote, bullet in the head, although hospital records mention no bullet hole.
I don't know about that, and Garrison could never find it. The motorist who supposedly ran Rose over was not at the address that he gave, and Garrison had no way of investigating there. I want to say something else about Garrison, and that is how short-staffed he was. He only had a few people, 3 or 4 people working on this case. He had very little money. He had to borrow money from the Volkswagen dealer down there. He had a small group called Truth and Consequences, and for a while they gave $100 a month for his investigation, and then they stopped after a few months. He really was working on a shoestring, and so there were a lot of areas that he couldn't investigate, and I think the death of Rose Chermy was one. Another was Paese Serra and all the information that they had given about the CIA's role in European politics. Garrison just did not have the resources to follow up on these aspects of the case.
And Joan, many of his witnesses who he nailed, and they were key and central witnesses, they simply went into other states, and then the governors refused to extradite them. Would you give
Well, that's true, and I think we have to realize it was Walter Sheridan, on behalf of the Department of Justice, who telephoned the governors of those states where the witnesses were and ordered them not to extradite. It was true in Ohio in the case of Gordon Novell. Gordon Novell had been charged as a material witness by Garrison. He wanted him to talk to the grand jury, and the governor of Ohio just refused to extradite Novell. The same was true of a woman named Sandra Moffett, who had been Perry Russo's companion at the party that I referred to, where David Ferry and Clay Shaw were, and not a single witness was extradited by any state back to New Orleans to help Jim Garrison.
You know, it puts me in mind of the time when we formed the Who Killed Kennedy Committee in London. That is the moment when the established media became absolutely rabid The Guardian at the time published an editorial in which they said that I was a pathological American who had a psychopathic loathing for the country in which he had been bred. They didn't say spawned. And I remember, Joan, when we were seeing Jim in 1969, I was joking with Jim about the kinds of attacks to which we had each been subjected over the years. And as Jim was so clear about this, if they don't off you, it's character assassination. Jim was subjected to the most relentless reinvention, character assassination. Even the vindication in a court of law wasn't sufficient when this fabrication about his taking bribes from pinball machine operators, which was a Justice Department plot against Garrison, was exposed. The New York Times to this day continues to write as if he had been convicted of this. And Jim used to say the following. He says, you tell it all as soon as you know it. Because there is no other immunity from the fate of so many of these witnesses, because the more you make noise about what we know, and that's what free speech radio is about, brothers and sisters, that's what Taking Aim is for. You tell it all as soon as you know it. You get it out there. You mobilize people around this understanding and this truth, so that the consequence of doing us in, to put it bluntly, is that you call attention to the information that you've been disseminating. They can only attempt to assail us and destroy our characters, and that they did relentlessly to Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison was the man who was going to be governor of Louisiana. In fact, he had been marked by as a coming figure in Democratic Party politics. He may well have been considered as a vice presidential candidate or beyond. His political career he cared less about. He sacrificed every prospect to his dedication to unfolding this truth and to exposing what he called the war complex. He said, what was the phrase that he used, Joan?
Well, he used to say the war machine.
Yes, but I meant in terms of let justice be done.
Oh, that's written on his grave. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. And his children put that on his tombstone. I hope the grave is intact over there in the cemetery in Metairie.
When we sent out notices about today's special, the 3-hour special, people then forwarded on to other lists. And someone called us, in fact, our webmaster, Mark Bilk, our archivist, Mark Bilk, called and said that on one of the lists, somebody had sent back a notice say, no, Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin at this day and age. Well, I recommend that this person must read this book because it shows clearly who Lee Harvey Oswald was and his relationship to Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Juan Valdez. And Joan, let's continue with the role of Robert Kennedy into obstructing this investigation. And you mentioned before that Garrison had very few investigators working with him. Some of them were inexperienced. He didn't have the funds. And we talked about Walter Sheridan planting Gordon Novell, but there were other people who were planted into Garrison.
Talk about James Phelan.
Well, wait a moment. What Maya is talking about there is the CIA document that several investigators found. The CIA allowed some of the House Select Committee investigators to look at documents. They could not take notes. They could not remove them or copy them, but they could look. And one of the documents that they found was a list of the plants in Garrison's office. And among them was his best friend, who was his chief criminal investigator, Pershing Gervais. And another was Gordon. I can't recall actually what's in the book. It's not even published yet. But I think that there was Raymond Beck, who was an FBI plant. And there's a whole list of people. There was William Wood, whom Garrison had nicknamed Boxley. And these were all people who were sent in to subvert Garrison's investigation. One of the people whose name was not on the list, I don't think, was a young Englishman named Tom Bethel, who presented himself as Garrison's researcher. And they were so short-handed that they needed him to compile the list of witnesses for the trial of Clay Shaw. And what Tom Bethel did was one day in the hallway of the federal courthouse, he handed the witness list to Clay Shaw's defense, to the lawyers for Clay Shaw. And that was Tom Bethel. Now, James Phelan was not in Garrison's office. James Phelan was just a supposed writer for the Saturday Evening Post, who turns out to report everything that he did to the FBI and the CIA. And those documents exist. Maya had a question about Robert.
Because this is something that is so startling to people, and you go into this in great detail about why Bobby Kennedy would obstruct the investigation of his brother's assassination.
I was really finished. The book was in proofs, and I just wanted to made one last attempt to try to figure out why Robert Kennedy tried to destroy Jim Garrison. And Jim Garrison, during his time, was absolutely perplexed by this. And Garrison would say, if it were my brother, if my brother were killed, I'd want to know what happened to him. He knew that Robert Kennedy was working against him, but he couldn't figure out why. And so I went down to Miami, and thanks to Gerald Patrick Hemming, who was one of the soldiers of fortune, who was involved in training people to go murder Fidel Castro, that Gerald Patrick Hemming remained friendly with one of the Cubans who was close to Robert Kennedy. And because of Gerald Patrick Hemming's relationship with this Cuban, his name was Angelo Kennedy, who changed his name from Angelo Morgado to Angelo Kennedy, I was able to have a very good conversation with Mr. Kennedy and to discuss what Bobby Kennedy knew and when he knew it. And I found out that a group of Cubans, among whom was Angelo, were working for Robert Kennedy. They knew that something was happening in New Orleans, lest anyone doubt that the assassination of John F. Kennedy was planned and implemented as much in the state of Louisiana as it was in Dallas in November of 1963. So these Cubans went up to New Orleans to see what was happening. And also, by the way, one of their roles was to protect John F. Kennedy. If they could find out whether there was an assassination plot brewing in New Orleans, and it would be from some Cuban who was disaffected and angry at President Kennedy because President Kennedy did not give full military support to the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, then maybe they could protect Kennedy, and they knew that there was so much talk of an assassination. So the Cubans go to New Orleans, and they, mixing in anti-Castro circles, they find Lee Harvey Oswald. They report about Lee Harvey Oswald to Robert Kennedy. So here we have Robert Kennedy, and this is something that has never come out, that Robert Kennedy knew about Lee Harvey Oswald and knew quite a lot about him this is several months prior to the assassination. They also discovered that Lee Harvey Oswald was an FBI informant. Now, this in case anyone doubts that Lee Harvey Oswald was a government agent. And Robert Kennedy thought it over, and he said, well, if he's working for the FBI, if the FBI has him under control, we don't have to worry about him. Naivete of Robert Kennedy. And so they let him go. And Angelo Kennedy then turns out to have been one of the three men, and this is extremely important, three men, two Cubans, and a man named Leon Oswald visited a Cuban exile in Dallas named Sylvia Odio in September of 1963. And they're talking about her help because her father was in jail in Cuba, helping them to do damage to Fidel Castro, to organize a movement against Castro. And one of them was called Angelo, whom we know is Angelo Morgado. One of them called himself Leopoldo, whose name was not Leopoldo. And out of Angelo's hearing, a couple of days later, Leopoldo calls back Sylvia Odio and says, you know, that Leon Oswald was really crazy. He said that some Cuban should kill John F. Kennedy because of what he did at the Bay of Pigs. Well, that sets up Oswald, doesn't it? It sets him. It helps the framing of Oswald by showing that he was talking about the assassination 3 months before the assassination. So that meant he was involved, right? Of course, Oswald always said he was a patsy. Well, here is Oswald being set up to take the blame for the assassination. Now, Angelo did not know about that call, and so during the weekend of the assassination, when he watches television like everyone else and sees Lee Harvey Oswald named as the assassin of President Kennedy, and here he was with Oswald at Sylvia Odio's in September. Well, he just said that he was viscerally sick. He just vomited. He was so upset. The person who made that call, Leopoldo, turns out to have been a CIA asset named Bernardo de Torres. And also with Angelo, both of them veterans of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And one of the interesting things that I discovered was that when Bernardo de Torres was deposed by the House Select Committee, the CIA visited the lawyers of the House Select Committee prior to the deposition and told them exactly what they could and could not ask Bernardo de Torres. And he was not to be asked anything about the period of time just prior to the assassination. And because the House Select Committee investigation was really run by the CIA, he was not asked those questions. And Gaten Fonzi, who was the Miami investigator and who had brought them Bernardo de Torres, is sitting there, and he thought to himself, and this was a wonderful line that he gave me, anyone watching, anyone looking at this deposition would have thought, of all the hundreds of thousands of Cubans, why did the House Select Committee choose this guy to bring in for questioning? And, of course, Bernardo de Torres, I don't believe, is in the United States any longer.
Now, in relation to this, we have to be clear. when you're down in Miami and you're talking to these people and you're meeting with them, the JM Wave people and so on, you're talking about contract killers who were in the business of killing Fidel Castro.
Angelo Kennedy is not so young anymore, and he laughed and he said, don't think, and I think one of the quotes that I put in the book, he said, don't think because I'm so nice, I was a killer. I was an executioner.
Now, not only was he a killer, but what's very important here, Joan, is, and I don't think anybody has ever uncovered this except you, whose killer was he? Talk about that.
No, he was not President Kennedy's killer.
What I mean by that, what was the relationship of Robert Kennedy to this plan to assassinate Fidel? And this unit?
Well, they didn't. Of course, he was not the killer because they did not assassinate Fidel Castro, who's, we have to say, is alive today. But I want to make absolutely clear Evangelo Mugato's affection for the Kennedys and his hatred of Fidel Castro, yes, and his willingness to participate in Robert Kennedy's personal set of plots against Fidel Castro. That's certainly true. And these are plots independent of the CIA's plots against Fidel Castro. But Angelo, his affection for the Kennedys exists to this day. And one of the things that he did was he showed me one of his prized possessions, and he comes out of the room with a photograph of John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and Teddy Kennedy. And it was tremendously moving to me to see his affection for these
well, that notwithstanding, I think what I think is of some significance here is, as you have documented, Robert Kennedy had an assassination team, plan, and project for the execution of Fidel Castro.
That's true.
And indeed, the people who were involved in this, which included connection with Lee Harvey Oswald, meant that for Robert Kennedy to expose the murder of his brother meant to expose his own plans with some of these very same people for the execution of Castro.
That's true, and also that he even knew Oswald. And one of the people down there, no one we would want to know, but one of the people said, "Goddamn, Bobby's got his brother killed."
Well,
so his mixing into those events led, there's a connection, certainly, Ralph.
I can remember, Joan, when I was at the time giving evidence with Dick Gregory before the Rockefeller Commission in 1975, and later I was on this Tom Snyder show. And as always, I was being asked, well, what, Robert Kennedy, a former attorney general, do you think he would be quiet if there was a CIA involvement in the murder of John Kennedy? And I said to Tom Snyder, you judge the silence in the light of the evidence, not the evidence in the light of the silence. What you've done here, because I said these people have blood on their hands. You think he woke up one day and said, isn't that interesting? Patrice Lumumba bit the dust in Congo. Isn't that nice? Yon Sosa and the leaders of the Guatemalan guerrilla movement have been murdered. You think that these people are immune to the carrying out of executions? They're going to expose the murder apparatus of which they are an integral part. You've documented it. You've elucidated it. You've exposed it. And you've explained not just the indifference to the investigation of Jim Garrison, but the fanatical manner in which Robert Kennedy and his instrument Sheridan sought to destroy Garrison, to eliminate witnesses, and to shut down the investigation.
They didn't succeed, of course.
They couldn't succeed.
Garrison stayed till the end, even until his death, trying to find out what happened.
This is WBAI 99.5 FM on your dial, www.wbai.org. We're speaking with investigative author Joan Mellen, the author of 17 remarkable books, and this one tops them all, Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History. When we come up on the next hour, we're going to be discussing more about the CIA. This has been a 3-hour special Taking Aim. There is no other station like it in the world, and that's why so many people are listening via the Internet to WBAI around the world. And we get letters from people in far away as Australia regularly letting
Australia and Norway and China and Cuba and Greece and just recently Mexico in response to our series on creating the next pandemic.
This is a book that you will read over and over again. You will underline, you will mark up. That you can see all my marks. Ralph has even more. And Ralph is somebody who's been working on the issue of the Kennedy assassination for countless countless years. Over 40 years. And still, Joan has been able to shock, surprise, and I must say, please Ralph to no end with all that she has compiled, prepared, and the remarkable analysis involved in A Farewell to Justice. Not only is this the corroboration of what Jim Garrison was doing, it goes much, much further. I wanted to quote something from your book on page 174, where you write, Oswald, Garrison concluded, had been, quote, an employee of the CIA, which skillfully nurtured him and convinced him that he was performing undercover intelligence assignments for the government, unquote. Oswald was, quote, bright and deeply experienced, if low level, and had he not been eliminated, he'd still be talking, Garrison said. The agency Garrison was firmly convinced was behind the assassination. The CIA is a major menace to the democracy I thought we lived in, he told the press. The agency Garrison was firmly convinced was behind the assassination. The CIA is a major menace to the democracy I thought we lived in, he told the press. Joan Mellen's A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's assassination, and the case that should have changed history. This is Taking Aim with
Ralph Joan Mellen
and Maya Schoen, October 11th, our special 3-hour broadcast for a discussion with Joan Mellen about her newly published book, hot off the presses, A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's assassination, and the case that should have changed history. We have discussed in the past 2 hours that Lee Harvey Oswald is not a lone assassin, was a government agent, CIA, FBI, U.S. Customs, and that Lee Harvey Oswald knew David Ferrie, worked closely with him and with Clay Shaw, that there was the planning and the implementation of the Kennedy assassination centered here in New Orleans as well as in Dallas, and Joan follows the Louisiana connections. And also we're going to discuss the setting up. We've discussed the setting up of Oswald as a patsy, but also Joan uncovered a second patsy.
But before we get to the second patsy, I want to make reference to the following. Richard Case Nagel, Joan, we've discussed him. Garrison believed that Nagel was, as you put it, the closest thing to the key to the assassination that there is in one man. The CIA had assigned Nagel to surveil Oswald in New Orleans in the summer of '63. And then Nagel uncovered the plot to murder Kennedy. If you find out what I had to do with Oswald, and he had to do it with me, you will know what this is all about. You have with Nagel writing to Richard Hopkins. But let's just look at him a moment. A military intelligence officer with the Counterintelligence Corps of the U.S. Army, recruited to the Central Intelligence Agency, first meeting Oswald in Japan. Nagel worked for the CIA Red Squad, spying on dissident organizations. He was investigating associates of what he called the right-wing extremist David Ferrie, and he was referring to none other than Sergio Arcacha Smith. Nagel went to Louisiana as Oswald's manager. He connected Arcacha Smith with Eladio Del Valle, who would be murdered in Miami after Jim Garrison was preparing to indict him. And he defined himself as having a special mission. He stated that the Ferrie Bannister group, which he had infiltrated, was Oswald's circle, and that these were the central people in preparing the murder of John F. Kennedy. And here we have Nagel writing to J. Edgar Hoover on September 17th, warning that Kennedy was about to be assassinated, naming Oswald's aliases, and then writing to Desmond Fitzgerald at JM Wave, in which he returns money that was to have been supplied to Oswald. Garrison wanted to interview Nagel. What happened? What did William Martin do? How was that sabotaged?
Garrison thought that Nagel would be the best witness he had. But just to make a long story short, and I tell it in the book, Nagel finally refused to testify at the trial of Clay Shaw that the agency for which he worked was the CIA. And that made him really not a usable witness. So after all was said and done, it was really not William Martin. William Martin was one of the plants in Garrison's office that we referred to in the last segment, and clearly had worked for the CIA before he entered Garrison's office as an assistant district attorney, and later immediately called the CIA as soon as he left. And Garrison, because William Martin spoke Spanish, now I can't figure out why would that be the reason that he sent him to see Richard Case Nagel. But anyway, I think Martin had volunteered. He was going to go interview Richard Case Nagel, who at that time was in Springfield Prison, which was a federal psychiatric prison. And Richard Case Nagel immediately saw that William Martin was CIA connected. But ultimately, Richard Case Nagel, what's important about him, I think, is his analysis of the situation, the fact that he knew Ferry, he knew Shaw, and he knew that Richard Helms was behind the assassination, and he knew that John F. Kennedy was threatening the power of the CIA, and that this was the motive. This is something that we haven't talked about so much today, that the motive of the CIA in destroying John F. Kennedy had to do with Kennedy's challenge to the CIA, which, as President Truman said in an op-ed piece on the front page of the Washington Post 1 month after the assassination, that the CIA was running a shadow government. And John F. Kennedy had made serious inroads in reducing the power of the CIA, reducing the power of the Director of Central Intelligence, reducing the activities that they were involved in, reducing their budget. And as a result of this, the CIA really was not just angry at Kennedy because of his policies, but because the very institution was threatened. And Richard Case Nagel, in a series of letters that he wrote to a friend in Mexico, reveals that he knew all of this. And he knew that Richard Helms was behind the assassination. Plus, his surveillance of Oswald and his foreknowledge of the assassination led him to would have been a remarkable witness. And I should tell the audience, we didn't mention, is that when Richard Case Nagel realized that the assassination of President Kennedy was being planned and that Oswald was going to be involved in it in some way, he went to a bank in El Paso and shot off a gun, and which you do in a bank meant that was a federal crime, and he was immediately put in prison, which meant that if he were in prison, he knew that he could not be implicated himself in the assassination. That's how close to the assassination plot that he came. Unfortunately, even later, years later, when Richard Case Nagel was about to testify before the House Select Committee, he dies. And so he never actually revealed all that he knew, although a remarkable book was written about Richard Case Nagel called The Man Who Knew Too Much by Dick Russell.
Right. Well, now, it's interesting, you see here, that we're describing Kennedy's designs upon the Central Intelligence Agency Covert Operations Division that was outside his control. But the operations to murder Fidel Castro were not something to which he took exception, and he was seeking to have... Wasn't he indeed, the Kennedy brothers, obsessed with James Bond and covert operations themselves, except they wanted to run them?
Well, I don't really believe that Kennedy's policies were what the CIA was so disturbed about. Of course, it ultimately comes to that the CIA operating, and I think we need to make a statement that the CIA does not operate alone as an institution, but rather represents the views of the Pentagon. Certainly it did during Kennedy's time, and that both the Pentagon and the CIA favored a ground war, which John F. Kennedy opposed. It wasn't that he was a Democratic or that he opposed the idea of fighting in Vietnam, but rather he believed that covert operations were the answer, special forces, Green Berets, and that if this didn't work, he would go in for a coalition government in Vietnam on the style of what he had in Laos. He did not want, and the Pentagon favoring that ground war, of course, got that war as soon as Kennedy was out of the way.
You mentioned Richard Helms. Could you discuss his role in the Kennedy assassination?
Well, we don't have, and I think I wouldn't claim to have, a scene in my book in which Richard Helms plans with various group of people whose names we know the assassination, but certainly the assassination emanated from the clandestine services of which Richard Helms, as Deputy Director for Plans, was at the head. And I also want to emphasize the enormous participation of the Office of the General Counsel Lawrence Houston in all of these events. Houston even went so far as to subvert a potential Garrison witness in the Shaw trial, whose name was Alfred J. Moran, and who was one of those witnesses who was a CIA asset, worked for JM Wave, and could have testified that he saw Clay Shaw at the Eastern Airlines terminal on the day when the name Clay Bertrand appears in the guest registration book, which would have meant that Garrison had the proof beyond any doubt that Clay Shaw was the man who called Dean Andrews as Clay Bertrand and said, please go to Dallas to represent Lee Harvey Oswald. And the CIA made a tremendous effort. Alfred J. Moran, who had no particular admiration for Jim Garrison, went to a cocktail party the night after Garrison's office interviewed him and said, Jim Garrison has an ironclad case. And what the CIA did after that was to do everything in its power to make sure that that statement by Alfred J. Moran was erased, and that Alfred J. Moran would then give another statement for the record saying that he didn't really mean it and he had faith in it. Garrison didn't know what he was talking about, and that he did not see Clay Shaw at the Eastern Airlines terminal.
I just wanted to go back again to the conflicts at the highest levels of state with Kennedy and the CIA, because you write here, in May of 1961, only a month after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy formed his own special group, meeting as the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Its express purpose was to bring the CIA under the control of the President. Quote, covert action programs of the CIA may not have been worth the risk nor worth the great expenditure of manpower and money, Kennedy told the group on May 15th. So what he wanted was his own covert operations group. You say General Maxwell Taylor, whom he appointed special assistant for intelligence, was to be on top of covert operations. Because you were talking before about how Robert Kennedy had his own anti-Castro assassination team and plans, and here we have Kennedy wanting his own CIA operations, much the way now that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was trying to bypass the role of the CIA with his own covert operations group under the Pentagon.
Well, which they've succeeded in doing. But I want to quote one of the soldiers of fortune. Ralph mentioned Gerald Patrick Hemming, who remarked to me one day, John F. Kennedy was the last president who thought he could take power. And I think that's really true. I mean, after all, Kennedy was president. He really thought that policymaking would be his and that the CIA would not be making contradictory policies to his own, apart from his general agreement that it would have been better for that thorn in his side in Cuba to be done away with.
Now, you remember that both Helms and James Jesus Angleton were defining figures in setting the platform and the program for what amounts to the murder of the head of state. And, of course, that Hemming had stated Helms is behind the entire operation to kill JFK. And, indeed, you cite Nagel himself as saying, Dirty Dick Helms ran CIA's dirty tricks. He was the person who gave the order for John F. Kennedy's murder. And this view was shared by Colonel William Bishop, Nagel's CIA associate, who said Richard Helms gave the order for the assassination.
When Nagel refers to dirty tricks, he's referring there to the clandestine services of the CIA.
Right. And Angleton, after all, had been a pivotal figure here, both with regard to the false defector program, which entailed Lee Harvey Oswald, and the counterintelligence operations, and working very much hand-in-glove with covert operations in all of this. Is that not correct?
Yes.
Let's talk a moment about the extraordinary revelation that you have made in this book about the second patsy, the rabbi.
Thomas Edward Beckham is the figure about whom Ralph is speaking. He enters the story very early on when Jack Martin, whom I establish in this book, was a longtime CIA operative. Jack Martin mentions him as someone Garrison should look into. Garrison brought Beckham ultimately before his grand jury, and I think one of the aspects of this book that's brand new are the scenes in Omaha, where Thomas Edward Beckham is moving between Nebraska and Iowa and to a safe house in Iowa run by the CIA in an attempt to evade the subpoena from Orleans Parish. Eventually, however, Jack Martin calls Beckham and tells him to go back to Nebraska, and he's caught, and he's sent to Orleans Parish. And he testifies to the grand jury and lies. Every word he says practically is a lie. And it's left at that. Years later, I guess a decade later, the House Select...
What was he being asked to...
Well, he was asked about Guy Bannister, about Lee Harvey Oswald, about Clay Shaw, and in fact, he knew all of these things. He knew all of these people. He certainly knew that Shaw knew Ruby, for example. Garrison didn't even know at that time what Beckham would reveal to the House Select Committee, which was that he was present at meetings in Algiers, again a name we all know now, and at the Town and Country Motel, which was owned by Carlos Marcello, discussing the assassination, that he was present at those meetings. Garrison did not yet know that Thomas Edward Beckham was given an assignment from David Ferry's lawyer G. Ray Gill to take a big bunch of maps, diagrams, and materials about Dealey Plaza to Dallas to put into the hands of a soldier of fortune who worked for the CIA named Lawrence Howard the week before the assassination. So he was really a courier for the people who were involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The House Select Committee interviewed him several times and got a certain amount of information about these meetings. And when I talked to Robert Burris and L.J. Delsa, they encouraged me to try to find Beckham and to see what more he could tell me. And so I eventually, through the help of his daughter, who lives in New Orleans, tracked him down, and then he told me of how, I would say, some months during the year 1963, he had a post office box in the same post office where Lee Harvey Oswald had his post office box and many of these other CIA assets had theirs. And he was given a ticket to go to Virginia. And he was taken to the CIA training facility, and he was trained to be a CIA asset, I suppose. He was, and the reason that they liked him, and there's a document that he gave me that no one has seen, and that his own handler, Fred Chrisman, gave him, which shows why he was of such interest to the CIA. And it said that he had no psychological guilt with respect to killing. So we can see that he was the kind of person that they could set up. And I should say that prior to this, in his early days, Jack Martin had tried to have him committed to mental health facilities in Mandeville, and in New Orleans itself, exactly the same pattern that was used with Lee Harvey Oswald, where Oswald was going to get a job at the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson. The same thing happened to Beckham. He was a figure whom no one would miss, and so forth. And that's really parallel to the type of assassin that the CIA had cultivated.
What was Beckham doing in New Orleans?
Beckham was from New Orleans, and Beckham was a singer. He was a country singer who sang under the name of Mark Evans. And when the House Select Committee, in a very hostile deposition, questioned him, it was Mark C. Evans. And they asked what the C stood for. And he was, even though he had never gone beyond the third grade in school, he answered, the C stands for country. And he said that he was part of the Louisiana Hayride, which was a famous, I don't want to call it a rock concert. It was folk singing. In the early days, they discovered Johnny Cash. Elvis Presley sang up there, and it was live radio emanating out of Shreveport. So he sang there, and he was just a courier, a runner, a person who was attached to Guy Bannister's office. And Beckham's father had put him in the hands of Jack Martin because Jack Martin had promised that he would help him in his singing career.
Remember that Jack Martin is a Central Intelligence Agency operative working out of Guy Bannister's office and with Guy Bannister.
And I must say that I'm the first to write that.
That's correct. But here is an extraordinary revelation that emerges from your meetings and discussions with Rabbi Thomas Beckham. What kind of conditioning and what kind of tests did they do on Beckham at Langley? If anybody has seen the Parallax View of Alan Pakula with Warren Beatty regarding the assassination of a senator and the way in which they program assassins and break them down, you would have thought that they had a blueprint of what occurred at Langley as you describe it. Why don't you give it a...
Well, I think it was exactly as Ralph says, as in the movie The Parallax View, where pictures are flashed on the wall and you have to give free association of ideas. You're taken through a labyrinth of rooms and you're asked to remember what you saw, and you're taught how not to reveal anything about yourself. You're taught not to smoke tobacco because the scent of the tobacco would give you away. And there were a whole series of, I guess, what we would call tradecraft that he was taught.
Right, you write in here, he was taught how to create false information. He's instructed never to volunteer an opinion on any issue. He must not brag about anything he has done. He must never talk about anything he has done in the past. He is taught to have only short conversations with people. And you mentioned that he meets somebody who has one white eyebrow, and
that's Robert Burris, to whom the book is dedicated, the police officer. And Robert Burris was interviewing him for the House Select Committee. So Thomas Edward Beckham said to me, I really didn't like that white eyebrow, because he should really have gotten rid of that because it gave him away. It was very amusing, actually. I told Burris about that.
In relation to this, Joan, we must reprise here. Beckham is groomed as a second patsy. He's a courier, as you say. He's carrying military diagrams of Dealey Plaza to the intended assassins, the actual killers. he is present during the meetings that include the central figures that we're discussing here, that Jim Garrison was in fact on the trail of, when he writes his book On the Trail of the Assassins, that's who he's talking about. There's a very poignant part of your description of the role of Beckham, and particularly your interaction with Beckham.
I want to describe that, Ralph. I think what you're referring to is after Beckham testified to Garrison's grand jury, which he denied everything. He denied that he knew Jack Martin even, who was his handler. He denied that he knew Oswald, and so he denied that he had anything to do with the CIA. Well, according to Beckham, what he told me was after that grand jury appearance, and he went home, he got a telephone call from Jim Garrison. And the person that was with him, that stuck to him like glue, was a person named A. Roswell Thompson, who was a figure in the Ku Klux Klan in Louisiana. And so blatant was the Klan in Louisiana that A. Roswell Thompson walked around in the white sheets. Once a year, he would wear the white sheets in public with the pointed hat, and he would go to Lee Circle and put a wreath at the foot of the statue of Robert E. Lee. And I think the best photograph I have in this book, and there are many photographs, is the figure of Robert Burris, the police officer, as I mentioned, to whom the book is dedicated, standing next to A. Roswell Thompson in his Klan robes, protecting his civil liberties. Because as a police officer, everybody's throwing rocks and, in outrage that here's Roswell Thompson walking around as a Klanner. And Robert Burris is protecting A. Roswell Thompson. Well, this same A. Roswell Thompson was with Thomas Edward Beckham on that day after Beckham testified before the grand jury, and Garrison calls up and says, listen, just tell me, was I close? And Beckham really doesn't want to admit to anything, and he says, why ask me? I don't know anything, and so forth. And what Beckham said to me, this is a couple of years ago when I did the interview, I wish I could have told him. I wish I could have told him how close he was.
Well, it's not just how close he was, but how right on he was. Right on target.
And Beckham, too, was frightened. He ran. He was a con man, and he ran from place to place. He could never settle down. He thought that the CIA was after him. And he lived that life until, really, the last few years.
Describe the revelations that Beckham has made to you and his role as a rabbi, which is an extraordinary transformation.
Well, he was half Jewish. His mother was Jewish, which I think makes you maybe all Jewish. And he became a rabbi. And his mother had always wanted one of her sons. In fact, in the CIA document it's not really a CIA document, it's an Army Air Defense document, but it refers to his CIA training, and it mentions that he's one of several brothers, implying that he wouldn't be missed in the family if anything happened to him, which was when they were thinking of using him as the patsy. And in later years, he became a rabbi, a practicing rabbi, and a person that dedicated himself to religion, and really trying to, I think, redeem himself, as many figures in this book did. Another one of the figures who tried to redeem himself, whom we haven't mentioned this afternoon, was a character called E. Carl McNabb, who was a CIA contract pilot. He also flew in the Congo. He murdered, during that time, I think if people remember, many nuns were murdered by there was CIA bombings, and this fellow McNabb was involved in that. And years later, he tried to redeem himself by offering Jim Garrison his assistance. And he was nicknamed by a former FBI figure who helped Garrison named Bill Turner, Jim, for Jim Garrison, and Rose, because I think the Rose Bowl was on at that time. And Jim Rose tried to help Jim Garrison, I think in part to redeem himself for those murderous CIA missions that he flew, many of them into Cuba, many of them where he risked his life, was shot down in the Caribbean. And one time he said he was shot down because we were talking about the flight of John F. Kennedy Jr., and McNabb was a crackerjack aviator. He just said he wouldn't have gone. But he described to me how he landed a plane at one point in the sea, in the Caribbean, 1 foot on the rudder, 1 foot in the water, and sat on a rock and waited for Radio Swan to come and get him. And another fact that I enjoyed very much was to find out that John F. Kennedy sent Richard Goodwin down to Gerald Patrick Hemming and these soldiers of fortune and No Name Key and asked them, would they please help him? Would they please take over Radio Swan and take it away from the CIA? Hemming refused.
And what you're talking about here is John F. Kennedy trying to enlist these contract killers, these CIA killers, as his own team, which is, I think, illuminating.
But also, I should say that their loyalty was to the CIA and not to the President of the United States, and they didn't do it.
And David Atlee Phillips who was in
Yes,
charge
in fact,
of Radio
that's right.
Swan?
Very good, Maya. That's right. Radio Swan was a project of David Atlee Phillips.
Could you describe what Radio Swan
Radio
does?
Swan was a propaganda, like we would think of Radio Free Europe, where American propaganda is broadcast to Cuba.
Ruling class propaganda, but
also, of course, also when the CIA pilots got in trouble, Radio Swan would radio for help to rescue them.
What I want to emphasize here for our listeners is that these are not just local yokels here. You are talking about hard contract killers in covert ops that involve the deaths of many and the hunting down of people. And Joan enters into the lair, encounters them, succeeds in inducing them to come forward, and has made the record. I mean, the revelations that emerge from her meetings with Angela Morgado, or not to mention Jerry Patrick Hemming,
Beckham,
or with Thomas Edwin Beckham, she has actually induced to come forward in full particularity and with documentation. Nothing before had succeeded in inducing this man to come forward. This is a person who, as Joan has described, lived his life in fear of his own elimination, because so many of the people who had guilty knowledge were quickly removed from the scene. They were found dead from karate chops, from heart attacks, from hatchet in the head. They don't survive long. There's a 4-volume work called Forgive My Grief by Penn Jones, which details some of this. Here's Joan in the lion's den, as it were, coming back with the evidence and the documentation and drawing the full political meaning of it in A Farewell to Justice.
We've been speaking with Joan Mellen about her book soon to be released, A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History. Ralph?
When we were describing the revelations that emerged out of the investigative work that was initiated in Italy by Paesi Serra, one of the emergent structures that elucidates how the ruling class effects its control was this strange thing called Centro Mondiale Commerciale, or World Trade Mart. There is the International Trade Mart in New Orleans. Clay Shaw, who has been involved in the Permindex and the Centro Mondiale Commerciale, at the center of the International Trade Mart in New Orleans. Where do you think John Kennedy was having lunch that day in Dallas? At the International Trade Mart in Dallas. What do you think determined the motorcade route, sent it through this obscure plaza, Dealey Plaza? What was Jim Garrison focusing on when he noted that Major General Charles Cabot, the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, who was obligated to leave the CIA with the firing of Allen Dulles, had a brother who was the mayor of Dallas and the father and grandfather before them? When we went to see Jim in 1969, what was Jim focusing on, Joan?
Jim was focusing on the cabals. Jim was focusing on the fact that John F. Kennedy had fired Allen Dulles, and Dulles' second in command, General Cabell, resigned immediately as a result, and that his brother turned out to have been the mayor of Dallas at the time that John F. Kennedy was killed. And Jim, even when I last saw Jim Garrison, was in 1989. I was in New Orleans doing research on the biography of Kay Boyle, and Garrison was still talking about General Cabell and the parade route and the assassination. And I should say that at that time, he had a bestseller, On the Trail of the Assassins. The movie JFK was being made, but these things didn't interest him half as much as the details that he had discovered about the Kennedy assassination. I think that Jim Garrison was, and I hope I conveyed in my book, his humor when people asked him how he thought that he could prosecute somebody from the Central Intelligence Agency involved in the assassination in a conspiracy in a state court in Louisiana. Jim Garrison said, "I guess I thought I was living in the country I was born in." And I think that's my favorite Garrison line. He liked to say that as if he were incredulous. This is not the country. It was not the country he was born in, and we today are not living in the country we were born in, and I think part of that flows from the cover-up and the lies that the American public was told about the Kennedy assassination. And when Jim Garrison, who had nothing to gain from this, as Ralph said, when he decided to investigate, he too was vilified. He was accused of being everything. In those days, it was the worst thing you could say about someone was that he was homosexual. He was accused of having died of, after he died, it must have been of AIDS, and he was the mafia, everything that you could possibly say. That he also didn't protect the rights of defendants, which was not true. It was Sheridan who didn't protect the right of the defendant, Jimmy Hoff. It was not Garrison. Garrison always protected people's rights, and Garrison refused to prosecute, as I said earlier, on issues of homosexuality, on issues of obscenity. When James Baldwin's novel, Another Country, was seized by police officers and taken out of the Doubleday bookstores in New Orleans, Garrison refused to prosecute, and he constantly defended civil liberties. And when Ralph and I were in New Orleans, I should say, in 1969, when we walked down the street, every African-American practically that we passed said hello to Mr. Garrison. I couldn't understand why, because I didn't understand at the time that Garrison got his support and was elected 3 times as district attorney of Orleans Parish because the black community supported him, the black leadership supported him, and the union supported him, not the other citizens of the city. And he won won re-election even after Clay Shaw was acquitted. And I also want to add, Ralph, that when you talked about the case when the Department of Justice brought Garrison to trial for supposedly having taken bribes from pinball gambling interests, pinball gambling was illegal at the time. What happened at the trial was that it turned out that there was a big man at Tulane and Broad, and Tulane and Broad was the place where the criminal court was. Oh, yes, there was a big man at Tulane and Broad who was taking bribes, but it was not Jim Garrison. It turned out to have been the chief of police, Joe Giarrusso, and what the federal government had to do was to bring Giarrusso before a federal grand jury. Garrison gave his closing statement. He eventually represented himself at his lawyer's suggestion, and Garrison talked about himself and about his life. Old children were sitting in the front row, and he said the last perfect person lived on Earth 2,000 years ago.
I wanted you to give an account of who was Pershing Gervais and how did the Justice Department deploy him to destroy Jim Garrison.
Clear thing in the documentation that Joan goes into in this book is the collaboration of major media, Newsweek, NBC, and other newspapers with the FBI in the attempt to discredit Jim Garrison and the investigation into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. That is why it is so important to have WBAI and to have a forum, an opportunity for Ralph Schoenman and myself and have Joan Mellen on this program, because it is here that you're going to hear the truth. Ralph.
Pershing Gervais.
This is a Shakespearean story. It's Garrison being betrayed by his best friend. And I think also we should say, although Pershing Gervais he was an ex-cop who was totally corrupt, and Garrison made him his chief investigator when Garrison first was elected district attorney in 1962, because he said, well, he needs somebody who knows the streets. Well, Pershing knew the streets, and Pershing took bribes from various nightclubs and places and cafes and so forth. And ultimately what happened was that Walter Sheridan, who was never through with Garrison, even after Clay Shaw was acquitted, Department of Justice tried to destroy Garrison. And Walter Sheridan came back to New Orleans and threatened Pershing Gervais. At that time, Gervais had been out of Garrison's office for years. And he said that we'll put you in jail on income tax evasion. And we have these documents, thanks to the JFK Act, unless you wiretap Jim Garrison and help us. And so Gervais used a tape recorder, and of course these tapes were all spliced and they were all altered. But he betrayed Garrison, and then at the end he decided nobody could control Pershing Gervais, certainly not the United States government. He was a law unto himself. And so finally, just as they were about to go to trial, Pershing, who was now in Canada under a witness protection program with a fake name, called his best friend reporter in New Orleans, a woman named Rosemary James, and asked her to come up to Vancouver where he was, and said that he had been trying to frame Garrison at the direction of the Department of Justice, that Garrison wasn't guilty, that all the tapes were incorrect, and that Garrison didn't have a nickel, and that everybody knew that. And of course the case then was really not going to be won. Garrison won it because of that. And when Pershing finally, the Department of Justice forced him to be a rebuttal witness, it didn't do any good.
Well, what you're talking about here is the suborning of perjury. The conscious and deliberate attempt on the part of Sheridan and the U.S. Department of Justice to frame Jim Garrison on a fabricated charge by suborning the perjury of a corrupt figure and creating scissors and paste spliced tapes to establish the guilt of Jim Garrison of something of which he had not been guilty at all, taking bribes for the use of pinball machines in New Orleans, the absurdity of it.
I want to just quote, this is a quote from James Angleton, which I think was sort of close to his death, and I got it from a book by Joseph Trento, which I think sums up the activities of some of the CIA figures in our story that we've talked about this afternoon. It's something that James Angleton told Joe Trento, I think. Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, Carmel Offey, and Frank Wisner. And Frank Wisner was the person who had collected French Nagel to be one of the CIA assets, the person who would eventually be one of the founders of Permindex. Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, Carmel Offey, and Frank Wisner were the Grand Masters. If you were in a room with them, you were in a room full of people that you had to believe would deservedly end up in hell. I guess I will see them there soon. Now, I don't know, you can't call that quite a deathbed confession, but it's awfully close.
Well, Joan, you remember that James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence and covert operations, had a drinking problem. He appeared before some reporters once, and he was drunk, and he made the following statement. He says, "There are many rooms in the mansion. I wasn't privy to who shot John." But, of course, he was more than privy.
Well, he was in the same mansion in any case.
Yes.
The one we're talking about. And I also, and I'm not going to quote it now, but it's in the book, I have a semi-deathbed confession by Clay Shaw, where he's visited his hospital. He was dying of lung cancer, and he told a French Quarter artist, George Duro, that Garrison was wrong, but someone like me might well have helped the CIA, might well have delivered a package, might well... He really does describe exactly what he did in the Kennedy assassination, aiding and abetting, being part of the conspiracy, certainly not a shooter, certainly it was not his idea that John F. Kennedy be murdered, but willing to participate.
Well, after all, in terms of deathbed confessions, we have the example of David Atlee Phillips himself. Why don't you
David Atlee Phillips, estranged from his brother and near death himself, talked to his brother. And this was relayed to me by David Atlee Phillips' nephew, Sean, and also was relayed to Dick Russell, saying that, were you in Dealey Plaza, and pretty much admitting that he was in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, not shooting, of course, but superintending. Another person who apparently was at Dealey Plaza, Bernardo de Torres, whom we mentioned earlier, was Leopoldo, the visitor to Sylvia Odio.
We have here in the confluence of these various people in charge of the covert ops and intelligence agencies, the truth emerging in spite of themselves, not only in their own words, but in the documents that establish their role. And in that regard, we have not just the role of the Justice Department, the CIA, and we have to keep in mind that a key figure in all of this was J. Edgar Hoover. And one of the other extraordinary things that emerges from this book is the role as Mark Felt. Not only J. Edgar Hoover, but specifically Mark Felt, the so-called deep throat. Would you describe what you have disclosed here about the role of Mark Felt in relation to these events?
Mark Felt was one of the people in the FBI charged with discrediting Jim Garrison. And he worked with the second in command to the Attorney General for the state of Louisiana, Jack P.F. Cremillon, trying to find dirt on Jim Garrison. And I discussed that really in the introduction to the book because to get an idea, the whole FBI was involved in the discrediting of Jim Garrison. One of the things that J. Edgar Hoover did as soon as Garrison started was to issue a directive to all special agents in charge to say, give Garrison nothing. And we have that in writing.
Yes, and of course, in relation to this, we were mentioning at the beginning of this program, Joan, the fate of such as Mary Sherman. And of course, we know that right after the disclosure that Perry was going to be indicted, he was found dead. There was a specific area of work in which both these people were engaged. It had to do with cancer. Would you describe it?
I'm not going to say too much about Mary Sherman and about her experiments, that she worked clearly in a government lab in the dead of night. Mary Sherman worked for the Ochsner Clinic, And Alton Ochsner was a very close associate of Clay Shaw, both of them CIA assets. There are enormous number of CIA documents about Dr. Ochsner. Somehow Mary Sherman is connected to the Ochsner Clinic, connected to Ferry, connected to the U.S. Public Health Hospital, where Oswald himself was carrying a vaccination card when he was arrested in Dallas. And that card came from that hospital. And I wish that people would find in my book many hints that they could continue this investigation. My book is not the be-all and the end-all. I hope I've opened up areas of investigation for people to go further, to look further, to find new witnesses, to encourage new witnesses to come forward. It's what Jim Garrison always wanted. He hoped that by Perry Russo coming forward and being public, other people would also come forward. And I think this is all we can hope for. And I find that I was very lucky, really, when I was in Miami. I'm looking at the book, and I find another soldier of fortune, Edward I. Arthur, who's well known to people who have studied the anti-Castro movement. And Edward I. Arthur told me he was warned by his CIA controller during the summer in Miami, the summer of 1963, this guy Oswald, if you come across him, stay away. And another CIA colleague at the time told Ed Arthur, Kennedy's not long for this world. So the idea that this was really an open secret, that the CIA was after Kennedy. As Maya said, the mainstream press has preferred to accept the Warren Commission report, although I think the polls overwhelmingly state that nobody really believes that Oswald acted alone. But the evidence is overwhelming, not only that what we know today, but even what was known at the time.
Now, it's the entire panoply of events, because they had placed Oswald in Mexico City, and this under the direction of such as David Atlee Phillips. What was he doing there?
I'm going to leave the Mexico City portion of the story to others. I concentrate in my book on the events that happened during Oswald's stay in Louisiana from April of 1963 to the end of September, shortly before he goes to visit Sylvia Odio. You see all the cast of characters, the CIA, David Ferry, and David Ferry's role, I should also add, we haven't had a chance to mention, was to carry people out of Dallas, if needed, right after the assassination and fly them to places in Latin America.
And that very plan of Ferry to take the assassins out, and the movements of Ferry in relation to Galveston and Dallas, was the subject of meetings for which there were witnesses and part of the extraordinary documentation in A Farewell to Justice.
One of the people I found, and I never dreamed that I would, was a friend of David Ferry's called John Wilson. And John Wilson had seen Lee Harvey Oswald giving out his leaflets on Canal Street. And then John Wilson was visiting Ferry at his apartment, and who should he see there but the same fellow who had been giving out the leaflets. And he said, well, what's he doing at Dave's? So in case anybody doubted Perry Russo that he did see Lee Harvey Oswald up there, here's John Wilson, who really hasn't been involved with this case at all, has talked to no writers or has been interviewed by no government bodies reporting on what happened.
And you described many participants in gatherings, shall we call them, at Clay Shaw's residence, in which they were deep in discussion about the assassination, witnesses to Ferry, witnesses to Oswald, witnesses to Shaw, present together, and then in later meetings with Bannister. By the time you come to the vast number of witnesses you've produced and the evidence and documents of their meetings and their discussions, there isn't a scintilla of doubt as to the mechanism and the method and the implementation of the execution of John Kennedy.
Lee Harvey Oswald was not a loner. He was a government agent. Joan reveals that not just a government agent for the CIA and the FBI, but involved with U.S. Customs. And she goes into Oswald's operations for these agencies. He's closely connected with the anti-Castro figures in New Orleans. It's a total mythology about Oswald being in favor of Castro. That was the cover-up to set him up as a patsy, of which he wasn't aware. This included Clay Shaw, who Garrison prosecuted, David Ferry, and a Cuban associate of Shaw's at the International Trade Mart named Juan Valdez. There's an enormous cast of characters. Joan goes into the role of the FBI and of Attorney General Robert Kennedy to obstruct the investigation, planting people into the Garrison crew of investigators, working with the major media, Newsweek, NBC, and other publications to discredit Jim Garrison, going so far as to prosecute Jim Garrison, the district attorney, and later who became judge in New Orleans.
Yes, Maya. Jackals for the CIA, Chapter 17. In Jackals for the CIA, you will find person after person exposed for their CIA connections who are connected to Oswald and who were involved on behalf of the authorities in framing Oswald and in establishing the cover story for the execution of the president. The imputation to a presumptive Marxist for the purpose of a political adventure that was the real underlying context of the assassination itself. This is a revelation, this book, and it is not just a revelation, but it is an establishing documentation of what actually occurred. Please support it, obtain it, promote it, disseminate it, make it your own, and let's continue this struggle, brothers and sisters. A farewell to justice defines what occurred in relation to the execution of the head of state, but it also describes our subsequent history and the period during which we are living at this very moment. For all of the events that define the execution of the head of state provide the platform for the conduct of our affairs, for the treatment of our citizens, and for the nature of the state apparatus that has control over us. The martial law state has its roots in the murder of Kennedy. The hegemony of the military and the Central Intelligence Agency in our lives and the destruction of the formal protections that we have taken to be our birthright are a direct lineage with the execution of the head of state, and not just the cover-up, but the internalization of all of those processes and the embrace of treason at the highest levels. Joan is going to be talking about a farewell to justice across the United States. Support that effort. Carry on the struggle, brothers and sisters.